All right, hello everyone. It's been a couple of months, so I thought it's time to do another live stream. And there's certainly no shortage of topics that I'd like to cover. I'll see what I can get through in the time that I have, well, this evening for me. You may notice that my background is a bit different. These are my new digs for the moment. Unfortunately, we don't have the bookshelves, so my credibility is significantly lessened, but we'll soldier on. Also, sorry, the picture looks much grainier to me. I don't know why. It's the same camera, maybe the lighting or something. I'll see if I can fix that another time. But anyway, you're not really here to see me anyway. You're here to watch the amazing apologetics content that I will be reviewing. So the title today is, hang on, this isn't what I want. No, that's what I wanted. The title today of the video is, a little bit sensationalist, but I kind of do mean this seriously because there were two videos that I watched most of, both from Sean McDowell's channel, and I was so thoroughly underwhelmed by the arguments that were presented that I wonder if some of the Christian apologists have just sort of given up on actually trying to give an argument for things, for Christianity or for theism or for whatever, and have just sort of resorted to, well, we'll see what they've resorted to. But so I thought it would be interesting to dissect these. And why am I getting so many notifications in the background? Sorry, let me just turn that off. It's distracting me. All right. So yeah, let's introduce the first video. Welcome, first commenter, by the way. The first video here is from Sean McDowell's channel. This is an interview that he did with Larry Sanger. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's actually one of the co-founders of Wikipedia, and he has a PhD in philosophy. Now, I don't know too much about this guy. I did a bit of a brief background read, and it sounds like that in the years since he was involved with Wikipedia, he hasn't been involved in Wikipedia for a very long time. He left fairly early. I can't remember the exact year, but like 2005 or 6 or something, I think. Wikipedia was initially founded in 2001, I believe. And so he hasn't been involved in it for a long time. He's become quite critical of it. And to be honest, he's turned into kind of a loon. He has a lot of out there opinions, but we're not here to go over all of those. We're here specifically to respond to this interview that he did. And the first half hour, which I've just skipped, was incredibly boring. I mean, it gives some background about his life and his journey from a non-believer. Well, he was raised as a nominal Christian, I think Lutheran, he said, and then left as a teenager, and then eventually is just recently returned to Christianity. So, it gives some of that background, but for half an hour, I think that they didn't really get through that much of interest. Now, where I'm starting off playing is where he's starting to talk about reading the Bible again as an adult. This was like a year or two ago, so like relatively recently for him. The context here is that he was worried about the crimes of people like Jeffrey Epstein and how that might be Hope we're back. Let me know in chat exactly what that looks like for you. I don't know if the audio cuts out as well. I've had internet trouble lately. But anyway, as I was saying, Sanger here was interested in the relationship between the occult and pedophile rings or something like that, and that led him to talk to someone who recommended reading the Bible. I don't fully understand how that makes sense, but if you don't believe me, you can just listen to the 5 minutes before that. But we're jumping in at him reading the Bible, because what I actually was interested in is, I just froze for a few seconds. Okay, thanks for that. That's not too much of a problem. What I'm interested in is what are the arguments that he gives for coming back to Christianity. Why should we take Christianity seriously? What is the, how should we interpret the Bible and its reliability and things like that? Okay, so let us
start with it. Maybe I was led by the Holy Spirit. At first I was just going to read it for bedtime reading, and I did that for maybe 3 or 4 days, but then it was so fascinating. I actually read parts, the same part that I read to my son a few years before, and had made no impression of this sort at all. But this time I was doing something different, because I said, okay, look, I'm not just like reading this to my son so he's familiar with like the verbiage and the concepts and the characters and so forth. No, I actually want to understand it on its own terms. I actually wanted to understand what the Christians believe. All right. And
so far, so good. Let's see where it goes from here.
This meant, and this is something I would insist on strongly now, that if you're going to study the Bible and understand it, you have to understand it the way that the people who believe it understand it, not the way that modern scholars understand it, because they're wrong. They don't take it the way the ancient Hebrews did, the ancient Christians did, or modern Christians did. So
So this was, I think, the claim where I knew I had to cover this video, because Larry Sanger is not a biblical scholar or a theologian. He has a background in philosophy, I think epistemology specifically, which I find bizarre because I think his epistemology is awful. But anyway, so he claims that essentially all modern biblical scholars, I mean, he didn't make any qualifications there. He just said modern biblical scholars are wrong about the Bible with no qualifications. And I don't understand why Sean McDowell didn't push back against that. For a start, there are plenty of modern biblical scholars who are like very conservative theologically. And there are plenty who are theologically liberal. There are plenty who are in between, something else. So I don't know how they can, and I suppose they can all be wrong, right? But like, you know, there's a wide range of views about pretty much everything. So it's quite hard to understand how everyone could be wrong. And apparently Larry is the one who's got it right. He knows what how the Bible was originally understood by those who wrote and shared it back in, well, depending on, he's initially actually talking about the Old Testament, so back in like the first millennium BC. I don't know how Larry Sanger knows that, because at least in the part that I listened to, he doesn't explain how he knows how it was originally understood. Maybe he's got a time machine that he's sequestered away and he's not telling us about. But I just couldn't believe that he just made that sort of claim. That people who make a living studying the Bible from all sorts of backgrounds, like theologically and so forth, are just sort of wrong categorically about what it means and about how people have interpreted over history. And by the way, and he also stated that he also talked about how Christians or before that Jews understood the Bible as if there was like one way that it was understood, which is like demonstrably wrong. You can tell different perspectives theologically just by reading different books of the Bible, that they have different views. And this has been widely discussed, right? So this is just pretty, I don't know, astonishing thing to say at the very outset, that the biblical scholars are all wrong without qualification about the meaning of the Bible. But all right, apparently Larry here is going to tell us what it really means.
I actually used, I used gotquestions.org, isn't it?
Yeah, it's great.
It's a good website. It's got, I mean, it's very, reformed, but it's got a lot of solid stuff in it, a lot of good answers. And my hat is off to those guys, and plenty of videos. Might have watched.
So this is interesting. So he, instead of reading, critical commentaries or papers from books from biblical scholars, or attending a course, or really any other thing that you could do, he went to gotquestions.org, which is a Christian question and answering website. This is especially bizarre because, I mean, as far as I know, this is just like anyone can answer the question, right? I think it gets upvoted and downvoted. One of the reasons that Larry was critical of Wikipedia was because he thought that there was a need for greater peer review of articles, or really peer review from experts. I mean, expert review of articles, which Wikipedia doesn't have. Now, I suppose that doesn't automatically follow through to your Bible study, but it just seems a very strange thing for him to say, given his views about other sort of reliability and expertise in other areas, that he just completely doesn't care about that and just takes his information from this question answering website. Apparently, the people on this website know what the Bible means and they're correct, but all the biblical scholars are wrong. This is just utterly bizarre. Like, where do you get this from? How is Sean McDowell not critiquing this, not pushing back against this?
A video of yours at some point,
okay,
and so forth. So I would like ask a question. So I think that actually is what did it, right? Because it was my intention merely to understand. But then when I started doing that, it became really interesting. And the thing that was amazing to me.
Now, this already doesn't make sense, because if his intention was to understand, why did he just ignore all of the experts? I mean, a lot of atheists are critical of biblical scholars, rightly so. I mean, but Larry just sort of decided that they're not to be trusted, all of them. But this forum is fine, right? This question and answer website. So he wants to understand it on its own terms and just to understand. But somehow he understood everything well enough to know that all of the experts were wrong, like biblical scholars were wrong. I don't really know how that's supposed to work. How did he have enough knowledge to know that they were all wrong, but then this website was the right place to go? And how do you assess the answers that are given there when you don't have any or little knowledge yourself? Doesn't really make any sense to me. And as an epistemologist especially, I really have no idea how he makes any sense of this.
I actually looked up answers to my questions, which initially I didn't necessarily believe. I was just acquainting myself with the answers, But what I was amazed to discover is that the 2,000-year-old history of theology had been asking and answering these questions, and their answers, at least given sort of modern formulations that were palatable to me, they actually made sense. They weren't incoherent. And I'll tell you this other thing. This is going a little bit beyond this point in the narrative, but I actually.
So not being incoherent is an extremely low bar for any theory, really, or any explanation. So I'm not really sure why that should be shocking. If you've got 2,000 years to work on it, you'd better come up with something that's at least not incoherent. And by the way, I disagree with that on a number of points. I think that Christians have failed in 2,000 years to come up with a coherent explanation of the Trinity or the Incarnation, or for a variety of biblical inaccuracies or tensions, like, for example, the dating of Jesus's birth and the with the death of Herod and the date of the census. It's just, we don't even have records of that census, but like it doesn't add up. There's no coherent explanations I've ever heard of that. So like there's a bunch of things that I actually don't think there are coherent explanations for. And sure, there's a bunch of things that there are coherent explanations for. I mean, you've got 2,000 years and a lot of creativity. Larry is not incoherent. But like it's a strange thing to say as this sort of overawed compliment that like, well, it wasn't incoherent. Like, okay, well, what was it though?
We started writing a commentary of Genesis. It ended up being over 500 pages long.
Oh my goodness!
It is basically study notes. It's questions and answers. And I asked every question that I could think of about the book of Genesis as I went through it. And some days I would spend like over an hour writing out answers.
So just bear in mind, this guy wants to understand Genesis specifically, and he wants to understand it, I think, given what he said, from the point of view of those who initially wrote it or read it or had it read to them. So we're talking about Jews from at least 2,500 years ago. And some of the texts may go back to 3,000 years ago. And somehow Larry thinks he can understand that by ignoring all of the scholars and going to this one website. I mean, I don't know exactly your post. There's probably some good posts there. There's probably some not so good posts there. But like, I don't know how he assesses that and how he then somehow puts himself in the position of being a biblical scholar who can write 500 pages on Genesis when he says all of the biblical scholars are wrong and he has no formal training in this. He's clearly not reading it in the original language. I mean, he doesn't know ancient Hebrew for a start. I mean, then there's all of the, historical context, literary context, archaeological context, and so on and so forth, right? Where does he get the background of this? Well, his website, I guess. And as long as it's not incoherent, then he thinks it's fine. Like, how can someone who studies epistemology think that this is an appropriate method to study anything? Like, it's utterly bizarre.
And I was able to answer every single one. And that was shocking to me as I proceeded through. In other words, let's put it this way. I'm not saying that I could give a logical proof of the compelling, nature of a particular doctrine. No, that's not what I mean. What I mean is that I could ask a certain question about what was meant. Why did Israel? Why did he make his family and his followers wash before the sacrifice?
Okay, so let's think about the standard he's setting for himself, right? The standard is when he reads the text, he's specifically talking about Genesis, remember, and he comes up with a question based on something that happened in the text, right? In the story. And he has a question like, why does it say this? Like, what does this mean? What's the point of this? How do we make sense of it? His criteria is, can you come up with any explanation that is not incoherent? That is his standard, right? He doesn't seem to be, as we'll see, the slightest bit interested in whether that explanation is actually true or what evidence there is for that explanation. Merely, can you come up with something that is not incoherent? And this is essentially what we call fan theories, right? So it's like the example I like to use is Star Trek, right? Because I'm a big Star Trek fan. And there are a lot of, because there are so many writers over the decades that the different iterations, by the way, nothing subsequent to 2009 is canon in my opinion, by the way. So I'm talking pre-2009. But there's many, many writers who wrote over the decades and hundreds of episodes. There are lots of inconsistencies, right? And just plot holes and things that don't make very much sense. But here's the thing. If you have a sufficiently vivid imagination and spend enough time on it, you can always come up with an explanation that is at least not incoherent, right? That at least generally you can come up with something that reconciles it. Why? Because there's so many degrees of freedom. You can always invent something that reconciles them. When you don't actually have any evidential standard to adhere to, any basis for requiring that you demonstrate you have evidence for a particular theory, or any way of testing it, then you can just make up whatever you want, and it's just fan fiction at that point, right? And that's fun. Like, I think you can get a lot of enjoyment out of doing that. I like that kind of stuff, but it's really just an exercise in entertainment, and maybe like textual criticism. But there's nothing that tells you about reality, right? You're just making things up and having some fun with it. But that's what Larry doesn't seem to understand here, is that when you'll see the example he gives in a moment, all he's talking about is coming up with his fan theories about different aspects of the stories in the Old Testament, specifically Genesis here. He just gives no evidence that he doesn't evince any concern about whether or not these theories are actually true, whether there's evidence for them. As long as he comes up with them and they kind of seem right to him, well, that's all that matters. And this is why I say, have apologists just given up? I mean, I don't know that Larry Sanger would call himself an apologist, but he's being presented as some kind of authority on an apologetics channel, so I'm going to still call it apologetics. To me, this is an admission of defeat. Like, well, we're not actually going to give any arguments or appeal to evidence. We're just going to say, look, our fan theories make us happy, or we like doing it, right? They make sense to us, or they're not incoherent, and that's kind of it. That's just, well, I think that speaks for itself. Like that's just, I think you're giving up the game at that point. So you think I'm being too harsh? Well, let's hear what he has to say. He's going to give an example of how he can always come up with an explanation that makes sense with the events in Genesis, and here's the example he gives.
For example, all right, I ask that, and there's an answer, and not just it's a fascinating answer, right? Why did these characters keep getting renamed by either God or by kings? But all sorts of questions like that, and it's not, and there were answers that. Okay, not only were there answers, but the more of the answer or questions you asked, the more it actually made sense. So it didn't just withstand questioning; it encouraged questioning. It encouraged questioning in a way where you actually will not understand, and you won't believe it as well if you haven't asked the questions and learned the answers. So, like, okay, I'll give you a good example of that. So
here's the example I was referring to.
Why was Sarah, when she was captured by the second Abimelech, right, in Genesis 20, I think it is, why was she sexually attractive to him? She was 100. She was 90 years old, right? That doesn't make any sense at all. Well, okay, I thought about it.
Of all the things you could ask about Genesis, that's what really kept him up at night. Like, why was this 90-year-old woman attractive to this? I don't know who it was. The details of the story aren't really important for our purposes here, but I just found that hilarious. So, like, no, it's not about like creation or Adam and Eve or like the flood or Tower of Babel or like Abraham or anything like this. No. Why was this 90-year-old attractive? Like, because we all know 90-year-olds can't be attractive. I mean, come on, like realistically, even at times when like allegedly in the Bible people lived much longer, so 90 might actually be more like 50 or 60, and if you adjust it. But like, what a weird question to use as an example. But okay, look, it's his example. Let's see what he says.
different theories about that. I read different commentaries. There's free commentaries online that are nicely organized. So
free commentaries. But I thought he said that none of the Bible experts know what they're talking about. That seems like a contradiction. But anyway, let's move on.
It wasn't that much work. I came up with the following answer.
So apparently he came up with this by himself, which is, I mean, it's creative. Like, just remember what's happening here. Larry is telling us about how he came back to Christianity. He came back to Christianity by reading the Bible to understand it. And he apparently doesn't think that scholars are worth listening to. So mostly what he does is he reads it himself, and then he looks at things that people say online and comes up with these answers to questions that he has. The question that he's chosen to illustrate that process is, why was a 90-year-old woman sexually attractive to someone else in a story in Genesis? Everyone knows that a 90-year-old woman can't be attractive. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, global flood and all of the, Tower of Babel, miracles all over the place. We can believe that, but a 90-year-old being attractive, come on, that's too much. So we need an explanation for this, and he's using that to illustrate his process of conversion. Okay, so this is where we're at, and this is the explanation that he presents as being this sort of profound insight into the meaning and stories in the Bible,
which I haven't heard very much, but I think it's pretty persuasive.
Right.
Look, there was a miracle that God
good start. There was a miracle. Okay, sure.
Promised, right, that she would conceive and bear a child at age 90. Well, how is that possible? How would it happen? Well, there's two different ways for that to happen. Either her womb was rejuvenated, or the whole woman was rejuvenated. I say the whole woman was rejuvenated. And now the Bible doesn't say that. It's very, very telegraphic, which means it only says the minimum necessary for you to be able to piece the story together properly, right? So
it absolutely does not. Like, has anyone read Deuteronomy? Like, Deuteronomy just repeats a lot of the law that was already given previously in, like, Exodus or whatever. I don't remember exactly what book it's in, but like, there's a huge. And why do we need all that law anyway? Like, it's totally irrelevant to anyone in our time. And I mean, even most of the people who would have been reading it in antiquity wouldn't have been practicing all of that law. Like, the idea, and what about all the genealogies? Like, they're just so and so begat so and so. Like, there's so much junk in the Old Testament. I don't understand how anyone can say that it's like super concise and just what you need to have in there. But anyway, that's a bit of a side point. So apparently his explanation is that God's miracle of having a 90-year-old give birth also involved that 90-year-old being rejuvenated physically. And that's why she was attractive to this guy. I like this dichotomy he sets up between, well, look, either the uterus was rejuvenated or the whole woman was rejuvenated. And those are the only two possibilities. As if he couldn't, like, maybe he rejuvenated part of her, but not like all of her. Like, it feels like that there's other options there. I mean, also, like, God doesn't need a uterus to give birth, right? Like, he could just, I don't know, he could just have the baby come out. Like, he's God, right? Like, why could God only create people through uteruses? Like, what are you talking about, Larry? Like, that's obviously not true. Like, it's just, I mean, the whole thing is utterly ridiculous. Why are we even asking this question? Where does this dichotomy come from? And why do you think that that's a good answer? Like, well, I figured it out. The only reason that this 9-year-old could be attractive was because God needed her to give birth. And in order to get her to give birth, he needed to rejuvenate her uterus. And in order to rejuvenate her uterus, he had to rejuvenate all of her. And that made her attractive. Boom. Solved it, guys. And now he's a Christian.
You ask that question, and it becomes then, it's, you can see that she was entirely rejuvenated. She was made sexually attractive to Abimelech, the king. And that's how that's actually why that story appears there, right? Because, I mean, it's a weird interpolation, right? Another Abimelech story. Some scholars think that it shouldn't be there.
Apparently he does read scholars. I would really like to learn more about when he reads scholars and when he doesn't, because he gave the impression before that they're all none of them are worth listening to.
That it was evidence actually of there being different textual sources. It's cited in support of the documentary hypothesis. That's BS. It's wrong.
That's all wrong.
The reason is that Sarah was being shown to be sexually attractive, and this had to have happened at exactly the time when she conceived, right? And so, yes, it's illustrating, but you wouldn't know that if you didn't ask a hard question. So nobody thinks about this. Now, I actually think,
but you just said, Larry just explained that people do think about this because the commentators have written about how, I mean, I don't know a great deal about this, but like documentary hypothesis, as I understand it, relates to the different sources that were combined to produce. I think Genesis specifically is talking about here, the idea that there's multiple sources that were combined and compiled relatively late into the 1st century BCE. But the original texts were older than that, and then probably oral history predated that even further. And this may be why you get different versions of certain stories or interpolations, as he mentioned, because you essentially have different sources that are being sewn together. I don't know the specifics of that, but that's like how I understand the general picture. And that's all very interesting, right? But then he's just like, nah, that's all wrong. It's because God needed to make her fertile again. Like, that's why we see this here, guys. It's not because it's these different sources. It's because of the renewal of the uterus. Like, dude, this is insane. Yeah, I wasn't saying that Larry as such counts as an apologist. What I was saying is this counts as apologetics because of the context and the show that it's on and everything like that. Like, it's supposed to be a defense of the faith or contribute to a defense of the faith. So I think it's fair to treat it in that line. I mean, if you look at the thumbnail as well, it's like from skeptic to believer, or like 35 years of skeptic to believer or something like that. Like, he's positioned as someone who can think critically about these issues, and that you should listen to as a result. And from this interview, like, the guy seems like an absolute clown. Like, I don't understand why anyone would take anything he says about anything seriously, given what he said here.
you have to do this with every part of the Bible.
Amen.
If you don't.
Why is Sean not pushing back on any of this? This is just utter drivel. Like, what is the guy talking about? He's like foaming at the mouth. Why is he sexually attractive? Documentary hypothesis is wrong. Like, just totally crazy. I don't think Sean would agree. I don't know what he thinks about the composition of the Old Testament, right? But like, just to throw all of the scholars under the bus like that and dismiss it and put in this place this sort of crazy fan fiction. I don't know how Sean can defend that sort of thing. I mean, he's not defending it, but he's not saying anything about it here.
Really carefully analyze the Bible. You're not going to learn all the things that there is. And the thing, to get back to the point, the thing that I discovered is that when you ask the hard questions and you really try to get to faithful answers, the answers of the sort that the people who believed the text had in mind.
Larry, how do you know what people 2,000 or 3,000 years ago had in mind? How do you know that? I mean, I think there are ways we can infer that, but it's not easy. And you can't do it by just reading the text in English translation and looking things up, like looking up your questions on a question and answer side. I mean, how do you even know that you're asking the right questions? You have the background information to understand these things. I'm not saying I know what the Hebrews in the first millennium BCE had in mind when they were reading and writing these texts. But that's the sort of thing you need to do careful research to understand. But apparently Larry just thinks he can sit in his chair and Google some things on his question and answer website and figure it all out by, asking these questions. Like, this is just ridiculous. Like, why would you think that you can get into the minds of people from 2,000 to 3,000 years ago just by like armchair thinking about it?
The original recipients, the smartest of them, what they understood, what they had in mind, then you will discover all sorts of things that you can't see in the text. This is the only proper way to understand the Bible, and it's the way to.
So if you ask these hard questions and think about it from the point of view of the people at the time these texts were written, completely unexplained how you get to that point of view from our modern point of view, then according to Larry, you will be able to understand things that are not in the text. So you can get something out of the text that's not actually in there by just thinking about it from the perspective of people at the time. That in itself is not entirely crazy, but like, you want to be really careful if you're going to say things like that. Like, maybe you can get some context by understanding from the historical. Yeah, learning more about the historical context in which something was written can give you insights that help you understand the text that might not otherwise have been evident, right? But when you're going to say that you can find all of these insights that aren't actually in the text from just kind of thinking about it, but not actually doing any serious research about the historical context or the development of the text and things like that, then it just seems like you're making stuff up. I don't know how any of that is grounded in anything.
Make the Bible the most persuasive. So anyway.
I love hearing you say this more than I can describe, Larry, because I've heard from so many people growing up that ask questions like you did. I was a question asker, and my dad was like, "Let's talk."
Did you really ask that question, Sean? Be honest. Did you ask that question? Why is what was her name, Sarah, sexually attractive to Abimelech at the age of 90? Like, asking the big questions.
Talk about it. Tell me your questions. Was not threatened by doubts. So many people afraid to ask questions, turned away, and understandably don't feel welcome in the church. And yet I tell my students the same thing. I'm like, if you actually go to the text and you look for answers, the vast majority of time, it might take some research and thought, you can find them. And you see this, one of my favorite comments.
Yeah, so if your threshold is just, if you can make up a fan fiction that feels right to you, then of course you can find them. Like, literally anything can be explained with enough imagination and time. This is why I say, I think they've just given up. Like, this type of apologetics, at least, is just an abdication of any intellectual responsibility or sense of standards. It's just like, well, I can make up something that kind of feels all right to me, so we'll just go with that. Like, okay, I mean, if that's what you want to do, you can do that, but don't pretend that you're engaging in some sort of intellectually defensible enterprise. That's just a joke.
Commentaries in the Old Testament is by Dennis Prager, who's a Jew. And he starts by saying we should ask questions of the text. And when we do and we probe, because Israel means wrestle with God, it's amazing the responses that we can find. So it seems like your story is kind of coming full circle from somebody, you know, not kicked out of the church, but not welcomed because of questions, to finally saying, wait a minute, I'm a question asker. I'm a philosopher. There's a place for me, a seat at the table, so to speak. And if I use my mind, I actually find that this is true. I love that. I just have to emphasize it for all my viewers, that we will not turn people away asking questions in the church, but invite them in and not be threatened by it. One of the next things you talk about.
Yeah, so Sean has very deftly ignored all of the crazy specifics and that Larry just discussed, and just focused on the very general and safe point that it's good to ask questions and to think about things. And yeah, okay, sure, we can all agree with that. That's good. And there are churches that strongly discourage that. I mean, I was part of one. So I agree, it's good to ask questions, but we shouldn't just be satisfied with any old answer that we come up with that seems okay to us. That's not philosophy. That's not scholarship. That's not critical thinking. That's, you know, that's just doing fan fiction.
I thought, again, this was so interesting, as you talk about an experiment of talking to God. What was that experiment and why did you do it?
So, okay. So I told you how, when I was a child, I prayed, and a lot of times my prayers took the form of me saying to God and then just imagining what God would say in response. But even as a child, I remember this, I didn't think that God was speaking to me in response. I know there's a lot of people who think that is true. It's not true. You're just using your imagination. And if it's based on the Bible, it's much more likely. Now, it's possible that the Holy Spirit is actually guiding you in imagining the answers. You must not assume that he always is. All right. So that's all I want to say. We are not prophets because we can imagine God answering us. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, that sounds fine. Where he goes with this is quite interesting.
Okay. So when I was older, I sometimes had like deep, mostly moral questions for myself, needed sort of moral guidance. And so I would imagine a wise, this is going to be kind of strange, but I'll tell you anyway. I imagined a white-haired individual appearing outside my window in a floating car.
Okay.
It was just a way to make it
all right,
interesting. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. And I would like take a gangplank and get into the car, and I would imagine asking this person questions, you know, and getting answers. I even wrote down little dialogues, you know, of this. But of course, I never thought that I was doing anything other than a dialogue with. Even sometimes I would say a dialogue with God about topics related to God, because I wrote a lot about philosophy that never published. It's crap. It's all bad. But anyway.
I think that's an issue. So this idea of imagining a dialogue with someone when you're thinking about a difficult question, I mean, that's not really something I've done myself. I find his description of it a bit weird, but I mean, I think the issue is where he's going with this.
At any rate,
so yeah, Larry is actually a philosopher.
I decided to start doing that.
He does have a PhD in philosophy. He's published work on epistemology, which, as I said before, I think is really hard to understand given what he says in this interview. But like, he just evinces the worst possible epistemology you could imagine. I don't know. I don't have an explanation for that. I don't have an explanation.
Not again, experimentally, but directing my conversations.
Well, maybe not the absolute worst you can imagine, but like pretty close.
To God. And that just segued imperceptibly. There was never a time when I said, well, no, I'm talking to God now. No, that sort of turned into prayer. Like at first I was talking to God about the details of philosophical arguments. And, you know, it was often things like when I got into Psalms, like Psalm 19, I think, and 121, I believe. So some of the Psalms are very philosophical, and not just there, other places too. Just sort of like almost casual asides, you start analyzing and just start asking questions about them, as I was doing. It's like it placed things into a new perspective. And so again, I had these sorts of imagined conversations, and but I think it was the. I will say this: I continue to have these sorts of imagined conversations. Okay. I am not a prophet. I do not claim that the things that I imagine God saying in response are actually said by God to me. No, I insist, in fact, that it's just my imagination. But I do think that the more that we read the Bible, the more that we understand doctrine, the more accurate our imagined answers will be, right? So I think we have to, in other words, to put this, if you don't want to talk about play pretend, this isn't play pretend, this is serious pretend. If you don't want to put it in terms of play pretend, the point is we have to imagine what God would say to us. In other words, what the creator of the universe actually thinks about the about various things going on in our lives, or the thoughts in our heads, and so forth. We have to allow God to interrogate us, essentially. Imagine it. But unless you root that in the Bible and understand the Bible and doctrine, which is to say what you can infer reliably from the Bible, then your answers are going to be half-baked a lot of times.
You're kind of hinting.
So this is really interesting, because Larry basically says here that he started out with this practice of kind of doing an imaginary dialogue with himself about things that he was thinking about, and that kind of morphed into prayer. But he is very clear that he doesn't think that the answers that he gets from this like imaginary guy in his head are actually God speaking to him. But he does also say, and that as you get to know the Bible more and think through things more clearly, that your imagination will get more accurate or get better. And in a moment they'll link that to the Holy Spirit, right? So I think this is just really, I mean, it's interesting, his experience there, but what I find interesting here is the terrible epistemics of the situation there. Like when you start with the practice of essentially pretend talking to yourself, and then somehow, because you read the Bible and associate with certain traditions, convince yourself that there's something more going on there than just you talking to yourself. And it's interesting because Larry kind of is saying, no, that's all it is. But then he can't help but say, but there is still kind of more to it than that, because your imagination is guided by the Spirit or something like that. And I mean, different people will, I guess, interpret some people do think that God is literally talking to them. Other people interpret it more as like guided by the Spirit. But either way, the issue is that you're just sort of letting your own, from my point of view, you're letting your own imagination be the guide to how you understand reality. And that's just, I don't think, a good way to understand whether something is true. Like, I mean, even just here, we're supposed to be understanding how Larry was led back to Christianity. And what he just said is that you need to think about what the God of the universe how he would communicate with you. And to do that, you read the Bible. But we seem to have missed a step there. Why would we expect that the God of the universe has anything to do with the Bible? That's just an assumption, right? Like, where did that come from? You can't determine that by just reading the Bible and then thinking, oh, this kind of makes sense to me. Like, where did that, like, how do you justify that as I'll be interested in how Larry justifies that as a philosopher. Like I don't know if it's some sort of justified basic belief that just like you read the Bible and feel a certain way and you can just base things on that. I don't know, maybe. But the idea that, well, you read the Bible and you just sort of think it makes sense, and therefore you just sort of know that, therefore, because it makes sense to you after thinking about it in a certain way, therefore it must have some special relationship to the God of the universe. And therefore, in order to interpret your imagined dialogues with the God of the universe, you should think about it in the context of the Bible. Like, there's just so many leaps there, and so many avenues for fooling yourself without any real external way to verify this, that I just feel like it's completely indefensible as a intellectually robust strategy. Like, again, if we think of philosophy as loving wisdom, I don't know how you would really, I don't see how you can defend this as being a way to achieve wisdom. Like it seems to be a tailor-made way to just completely fool yourself, because it's almost entirely based on your subjective sense of what makes sense, your subjective sense of what you're telling yourself in your mind or in your dialogues, and your subjective sense of whether something is driven by the Spirit or whatever. It's all entirely or almost entirely subjective, with no self-correcting mechanisms that I can really see. I mean, maybe it's self-corrective because you engage with other people in church and they'll tell you whether you're on the wrong track or something like that. Like, but that's kind of it. So yeah, and again, I sort of say, like, is this what apologetics has come to? Like, you just sort of imagine it, and then that's, I mean, to be honest, this isn't really that different to what William Lane Craig says. This, like, you just pray about it, and then God will reveal it to you in some sort of poorly specified way. And to be fair, Craig doesn't say that that's an argument for God's existence. He just says that's a way to come to know God's existence. But yeah, I think it's a bit of an admission of defeat when you sort of put that front and center.
Hinting at what C.S. Lewis said, God in the dock. God is not the one on trial. We are the one on trial. And I think just one quick point before we keep going.
Oh, by the way, that is an example of something that C.S. Lewis was the master of, which is thought-terminating cliches. Well, God is not the one on trial. We are the one on trial. Well, if God exists, maybe he is putting us on trial. There'd be an interesting question as to why he's doing that. But kind of irrespective of whether God exists, from our egocentric perspective as agents, thinking beings, of course God is on trial. Like, we don't know, we don't have direct access to God. Like, we're not God, so we have to figure out if he exists, what he wants of us, which, if any, of the alleged prophets to speak from God are actually the ones who, you know, speak on behalf of him, and so forth. So if that's what you mean by put on trial, like rationally and critically assess, then it's impossible as agents, limited agents as we are, to not do that. I mean, we can abdicate that responsibility and just sort of go with the flow, like go with whatever we feel or whatever. But like, we're still making that judgment, whether we do it rationally or not. We have to do that because we just don't have direct access to knowledge of everything like God does. So this is why I think that sort of statement, "Oh, God's not the one on trial," but he has to be. Like, that's what we're doing. Like, even the whole point of Christianity is like God's reaching out to you, and you decide whether to like grasp back and trust in him. Like, that decision to do that is us putting God on trial, in a sense, like in an intellectual sense of like, do I assent to this? Do I agree to this? Do I accept this? So I think it's baked into the doctrine of Christianity, and I would argue really any intellectual or social movement, as whether you accept it or not. Like, does this seem reasonable to you, or do you abdicate reason and just accept it on emotional reasons? But like, you still make a decision either way. So of course God is on trial. Like, everything that you perceive, think about, make a judgment about is on trial. Like, in this sense, like, you make the decision and you evaluate, or at least are called to, like, you can evaluate for evidence for and against. So I think that this is just entirely silly. It's a thought-terminating cliche, like encouraging you not to think critically about the question. And I really hate statements like that, which is why I despise C.S. Lewis as a writer, because his writing is just full of thought-terminating cliches that encourage you to not think about things deeply and just accept something that sounds superficially good, but actually doesn't make any sense or doesn't elucidate anything. Random question: will James make a 5K sub Q&A video? I've never actually done a Q&A video before, so maybe a 5K sub threshold would be a good one to do that. But we'll see. I've been thinking about that. Anyway,
things
back to
the
this.
atheists would do is they would go surface deep on the Bible and go slavery, misogyny, genocide, God is terrible. And those are fair objections that we need to respond to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that saying that God is terrible because he advocates slavery is really that surface deep. Like, sure, you want to understand the context, to understand the details, even of heinous events. But I don't know. That feels like a bit of a flippant response there. If you see a really heinous things advocated for by a particular group, like, it's not that unreasonable to say, that's probably bad. Like, you probably shouldn't go along with what they're saying, or at least you should be very, very cautious. So I don't know. That feels like a bit of a cheap shot to me. Like, it feels entirely reasonable to have that response to a lot of the stuff in the Bible.
But I was reading Jordan Peterson's recent book,
not care about what they have to say about Jordan Peterson.
The premises of that particular argument. So all that the argument from contingency establishes is that a necessary being exists.
Yeah, I agree with this point, but
the Bible helped me to understand that. Just when I started studying what God meant when he was saying, and is it Exodus 2, I think, when he's talking about his name?
Exodus 3. I just preached on it this past Sunday.
Right, Exodus 3. And he says, "I am that I am."
That's
and
right.
Like, my first thought is, that is not grammatical. What does that mean? And so I looked it up, of course, and I said, why is it translated that way? And actually trying to come to it, to make a long story short, I learned the typical thing that is said about that, namely that it means that God is essentially existent. God is essentially being. And what that means is that God is life and sovereign. And there's a reason I say that, because what life is most essentially is an organism that keeps itself in its structure, homeostasis. It keeps itself alive. God is the most alive thing because he is entirely self-existent apart from all other things, which then leads you to the part about sovereignty. So if his existence doesn't depend on anything else, then everything else depends on him. Amen. If he is in fact the creator of everything, which there is reason to believe. So then that means so just interrogating that passage in.
Yeah, that's a lot to get out of I am that I am, my dude. Like, I don't really know whether the people who wrote that even had these conceptions that we have philosophically. I have no idea. But anyway, there's a bit of action in chat, so I just want to sort of respond here. We're not actually talking about Jesus at this point, so just a response to people talking about that. This comment here: God is on trial equivocates between two senses of that idiom, determining whether the God exists and criticizing the God assuming he exists. I agree, but I agree in a sense, but there's not just two senses. Because even if you think that there's a God, you still have to ask the question, what is the nature of this God? What does he want of us, if anything? Has he sent messages? Like, what scriptures are correct, like in terms of his actual message, if any, how to interpret them, right? You still have to ask all these questions, and you have to think about, or you should think rationally about the answers to those questions. What are the evidences for and against? And that is exactly the activity that the apologist doesn't want you to do, and uses the locution "God is not on trial" to try to stop you from doing that, or like convince you not to do that, or to diminish the activity of doing that. But what I'm saying is you have to do that. Like, even people who, again, don't think about it rationally are still doing that. They're still making judgments about what they think God wants of them. And I'm saying, well, we should do that rationally. And that's what they mean by putting God on trial. Like, thinking rationally, weighing up pros and cons, evidences for and against what God allegedly wants of us. But the point is, as limited egocentric agents, we have no alternative but to do that. And so I think it's completely a stupid thing to say. It makes absolutely no sense. Anyway, I hope that's sort of clear. That's a fair point. And he hasn't really said anything about Jesus so far. I didn't listen to I think I stopped around this point. So maybe there's a little bit at the end where he links it back to that. And yeah, there's a further question. Why isn't he a panentheist? Yes. So again, lot of leaps here. Like, you might think that there is some sort of self-sufficient, self-existent creator entity, but how you get to that, from that to the God of the Bible and like theism in the classical sense, I really have no idea. That you need a lot of extra steps there. But again, apparently Larry is just saying, well, all you have to do is think about this very puzzling phrase in the Old Testament, I am that I am, and you just sort of get all of this stuff for free.
Why God introduces himself that way, asking a lot of hard questions about that, helps you to understand better the very notion of necessity, of God's necessity, which just cast the argument from contingency in a new light. So the argument from contingency simply says, a bird flies outside my window. I expect to see an explanation of that. Well, it hatched from an egg, and this is what birds do. Birds, maybe they evolved, or maybe they came from somewhere, and they're part of this whole system. And ultimately, you trace causes back to an initial cause, and the bird also at a different level follows different laws, and those laws can be rooted and explained in terms of some fundamental laws, and so forth. You expect an explanation of all of these things. You certainly expect an explanation of why the bird flew by my window at that moment. You think there's a reason that makes that necessary, right? Well, why isn't that true of the entire universe and everything that's in it, right? Including the laws and the constants and so forth. That would be a necessary being, and that a necessary being that stands in a sort of explanatory relation to the creation. Obviously, the big question, the sophomore question to ask about this, the question I asked when I was 10 years old, talking about these things. Well, what explains God then? What explains?
Well, I was going to ask the question, you really think that the writers of Genesis were thinking about all this sort of stuff? Like, I'm pretty skeptical about that, my dude. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not, like, you can read things into a text that the authors of it weren't aware of, or you can build on their ideas. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. But the point is that Larry was supposed to be explaining to us how reading the Bible kind of convinced him to become a Christian. And like, these contingency arguments are all well and good. I mean, we could discuss those, but they're just not in the Bible. Like, certainly not in Genesis. You can really read them in if you stretch, like, I am that I am. And then he just goes on all of this philosophy, which was developed centuries later, as to how that somehow relates to the contingency argument. I'm really not convinced. If the reason you're a theist is because of the contingency argument, you can tell us that. But I just don't think that that really has anything to do with reading the Bible as such. You want to, I mean, if you believe that there is a greater deity, you want to then connect that potentially to the God of the Bible, which is what I'd be interested in hearing more about. So far, we've been here almost an hour, and he hasn't given us, as far as I can tell, any actual reason to think that the Bible is like the true word of God. The only reason he's given is that it's not incoherent. Like, it kind of made sense to him when he thought about it a bunch. And again, that's the fan fiction argument for Christianity, right? Like, it's, well, I like it and it makes sense to me when I think about it and fill in all the holes in my mind. So, I'm just gonna call it true. That's again, I think that's just giving up essentially.
And the point is that there's a difference between the contingent facts of the universe, which
I'm going to skip over this bit because I'm not
necessary in itself
directly interested in this argument here.
And it's the best explanation is the way to look at it. Now, I also found this super interesting. You described not having a mind-blowing conversion to faith. What was it like when you all said, just thought, okay, I'm a believer? And was there a sense where you had a realization of the weight of your sin as a part of that conversion?
Well, I sort of, I felt kind of, this is a little too dramatic, but it gets at the idea. I was dragged kicking and screaming into faith. Okay. I am not just philosophically, but constitutionally a skeptic and a question asker. And therefore I don't change my mind on trivial reasons. I don't like.
Kind of sounds like you did, my man. Well, it depends how you define trivial. Like, maybe not trivial in terms of the effect they had on him, subjectively and emotionally, psychologically, whatever. That's fair. And you can have that reaction in response to anything, really. But trivial in the sense of epistemologically, like how weighty is the evidence or the reasons, and how convincing they would be to a rational observer or something like that. The idea that, well, I thought about it a while and looked up on a Q&A website, and these stories kind of make sense to me and are not incoherent. That's a trivial reason to believe them. Like, again, you can do that for almost anything if you just spend enough time in imagination. I call that a trivial reason.
To make up my mind
but
about
maybe there's
things.
more.
And I certainly don't like to make up my mind very quickly. And it's distressing to change your worldview, because this required that if it's true that God exists, then there's a lot of things that I previously believed that wouldn't be the case. Maybe most important.
Well, like what? Like, okay, so this is something that Christians like to say, which I think is utter nonsense. They say, well, if God exists, then like all of these things follow. Like, it's a really important thing. I think that it's almost it matters almost not at all whether God exists for most purposes. Like, obviously, if you're asking the question, does God exist, or like, where did the universe come from? Well, it matters there, but like, those are very specific applications. Most of the things that Christian apologists or apologists from other traditions say follow from God's existence do not in fact follow from God's existence. They follow from particular theological claims that they make about God and what he wants and his purposes and commandments and other things like that. And none of those follow from God's mere existence. It's like you go to deism or some version of generic theism, and then somehow you just get all of the other claims, or like a bunch of other claims from Christianity or some other religious tradition, just sort of uncritically fall in place somehow. Let's see how, I haven't listened to this part yet, so let's see how Larry describes it.
Would be materialism. I actually was a...
Well, fair enough. If God exists in most ways of understanding it, then materialism is not true. But like, that's not necessarily that interesting, because what implications does that have for kind of anything else other than the question of, like materialism? If God is not material, then materialism can't be true if God exists. Like, okay, fine, but what else? Like, what significant follows from that?
Well, I was a kind of physicalist. I was a property dualist. But at any rate, but I didn't believe necessarily in a spirit world of any sort.
Okay, so God existing has absolutely no bearing, directly at least, on the nature of the mind. Like, philosophy of mind typically is concerned with the human mind, maybe animals as well, but you can be a physicalist about the human mind and believe in God. You can be a dualist and be an atheist. Like, there's really no connection there. The only distinction would be, the only relevance would be, well, if you believe in theism, then presumably there is at least the possibility of an immaterial mind, of an immaterial mind. But God is so different to us in so many ways that it's really not obvious that it has any particular bearing on the question. It's like, it's sort of implying here that if you believe in God, then that has implications, like direct implications for philosophy of mind or something. But I just don't see that at all. I don't think it has really any implications for philosophy of mind, because God is so different to us. Like, well, and God is immaterial. Well, I guess Jesus is embodied. Let's not get into that kind of words. But like, at least God the Father is immaterial, but we're certainly not immaterial. So like, there's obviously some big difference there. Anyway, I want to talk more about that another time. But I think that that's a huge leap. Like, I don't see any reason to make that.
The ultimate explanations of the mind, the mental stuff was in physical terms ultimately somehow, and that. But like, I changed my mind about that.
Why?
Because it's hard to. Well, let's put it this way. I decided to take seriously the possibility that I had been wrong about that.
He changed his mind because he decided to take seriously the possibility that he might be wrong. That's not actually a reason for changing a mind. Like, that's just a reason. That's not anything. That's just like, well, I changed my mind because I decided that I might change my mind. Like, okay, but why actually change your mind? Like, realizing that you might do it or that you could do it is not a reason to do it. Like, am I the only one who just doesn't see this as any reason at all? Like, maybe I've missed something.
And when I started investigating that question, I found that that the reasons that formerly seemed insufficient are now sufficient. A lot of what made a difference for me is that and this is what really made it a struggle, is that I was committed to methodological skepticism, right? So like, I'm really serious about not believing something unless I had really good reasons to believe it and I understood it very well. And generally,
my dude, that is completely not how you described your journey through the Bible, right? You said that something was acceptable to you if it just sort of made sense and wasn't incoherent. You never gave any basis for believing any of the things you believed in the Bible. You just sort of said that, I don't know, it made sense to you. Like, that's all we got. And then there was the whole imaginary conversations thing that like sort of turned into prayer, but is not exactly God answering you, but like maybe it's the Spirit or something is involved. We haven't heard anything in this hour and 2 minutes about why we should take any of that seriously. The only thing is sort of now we're getting vague references like a contingency argument, some vague reference to philosophy of mind. I'm not sure how that fits into anything. And now he's telling us, oh, I'm super skeptical. Like, I don't believe anything for unless I have good reasons and good evidence. All of the evidence you've evinced has been indicating to the contrary. Like, that there's no indications that he's been skeptical about any of this. Now, maybe he was, right? I don't have access to his mind, but I'm just saying what we've seen, there's been no evidence of that. So look, I'm skeptical that he was truly skeptical in the sense that I would understand it. I've changed my mind because there's a possibility Australia has drop bears. Yeah, it's kind of like that. And look, if you think about it, like, people ask a lot of questions about drop bears, but like, if you think about it for a while, you can kind of make sense of it. Like, then it's not completely ridiculous that there could be drop bears, right? There's an answer to every question about drop bears. So, I'm pretty sure there's drop bears.
Speaking, my standards of belief, I thought, were very high. So like, skeptical about, I thought it was basically impossible to know anything about anything very complex. And I said, well, if I'm gonna want to make up my mind, maybe I should have put this in my document there, but if I'm gonna make up, I'm gonna want to make up my mind for or against the existence of God at some point. That actually is one of the things that I remember thinking.
Okay, so already that tells me that he's not. Well, I mean, I don't like the whole true Scotsman thing, but I would push this one. Okay, so a true skeptic doesn't just make up their mind about something for or against. A true skeptic always stays open, right? Now, that doesn't mean you don't have a judgment, right? And you don't think something's more or less likely, more or less probable. And you can be very far down one side or the other. I don't know if I'm over-interpreting the way he phrased that, but I mean, it sounds like, he just makes his mind up definitively one way or the other, and that's kind of it. case closed. That is not a skeptical position to take. Skeptic is always open to new evidence and new ideas, even if you think it's very unlikely. But the thing is, you always regard them with skepticism. You apply rigorous standards of evidence and logic and so forth to them. So this idea that, I just make my mind up and sort of finalize it, I don't recognize that as a skeptical approach. I don't, like, you might not think it's worth spending time on something. Maybe that's what he means. But that's, again, it's not quite the same thing. I don't spend my time worrying about whether homeopathy is, valid science or something like that. I think it's completely ridiculous. But like the idea that, it's sort of a matter of principle. Like, well, you're always still open. In theory, there could be evidence or arguments that you don't, you haven't thought of or heard of before. And I think that's kind of important to a skeptical approach. So like this idea of definitive mind making doesn't really exist.
And I said, okay, if I did decide to make up my mind, then how would I decide? And the more I read the Bible, the more I thought about the questions, the more I wrote about the questions, because I was writing a lot about philosophy of religion, essentially natural theology, it's called sometimes, in 2020, and I haven't stopped since then. The more I wrote about it, the more I became convinced that the case for the cumulative case for the existence of God really was stronger than otherwise. So if I was going to make up my mind, I'm going to go ahead and do it. But yeah, the thing that I can barely comprehend myself at this point is why I abandoned methodological skepticism to that extent. I guess.
Wait, so he wasn't being skeptical when he made the decision to become a Christian. Did I interpret that correctly?
A large part of it is I got old enough that I had no ego involved in that. I think there is a certain amount of ego involved in cherished beliefs of all sorts. And
but Christianity is not a cherished belief, so there's no ego in that. What?
Right, something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of your journey is getting older.
It really does sound like what he was saying is he used to be really skeptical, but he gave that up when he became a Christian because he read the Bible and he kind of liked it. So he's just like, I'm just going to go with this. I'm just going to make up my mind. And, some vague reference to the contingency argument, but we didn't really get much on that. Wow, that was something. I'm going to call it here. I think I'm kind of done with this. I know there's 8 minutes left, but sorry, I'm just having a quick look at chat there. It's pretty hard to follow a 6-premise argument in chat. I'm not sure. I'll have a look at that later. Anyway, so we've still got a bit of time. So that was Larry Sanger, the co-founder of Wikipedia, on 1 hour and 5 minutes of honestly absolute drivel, where the only thing I can really say, look, there's 2 things that he said there. One was he read the Bible and it made sense to him after thinking about it and looking on a question and answer website. The second thing he said was, 3 things. The second thing he said was something about he imagines conversations with God and that was helpful for him or something. And maybe that's driven by the Spirit or something, sort of unclear. The third thing was something about the contingency argument. It took him 1 hour and 5 minutes to explain all that. Okay, a little bit of personal background, but really, come on, we can do better than that. So a lot of it really just seemed to be, I like my fan fiction. And apparently even admitted to giving up methodological skepticism to become a Christian. I don't know if he regards that as a good thing or not. I just found that a bit weird. Anyway, let's move on to something else. This one. I don't know how much of this video I'll do because... got this? All right. Because I watched a third of it or something. No, that's not what I wanted. What did I want here? That's what I wanted. Okay, so what's this? This is a game-changing new book. See, game-changing is in capitals, so you have to yell it. Game-changing new book about the divinity of Jesus. And so this guy, Rob, here is going to tell us why we should think that Jesus is God. So this is more, New Testament focused, more sort of, theological defense of the New Testament and so forth. So
recognizes
that
Jesus
is loud
and is scared of him. In Mark 5, the passage about the legion of demons, they see Jesus. Mark makes this point from afar.
Okay, so I don't remember much too interesting in the first 20 minutes. What they're talking about here is just evidence of how Jesus saw himself and his authority in the context of, casting out the demons.
They see him far off, and they know who he is, and they're scared of him. And this implies that there was a prior knowledge of Christ on the part of these demons before Jesus even came in the flesh. There are many different ways in which this is evident throughout the Gospels.
Such a good example. I love that. Now, maybe frame this for me before we jump in, because I want to make sure we go through each of the letters of the HANDS acronym. Yeah. But sometimes people, I'll see, social media videos that'll be this simple, Rob, in 30 seconds or 60 seconds. They'll say, we know Christianity's false and the incarnation didn't happen because God is finite. And yet if you're human, God is infinite. And yet humans are finite. God knows everything. Humans don't. And then God was omnipresent. Jesus was localized. Clearly, this is false. Now, if you were going to give a TikTok or, social media response back to that, what would you say to help us frame this before we jump in?
So I think that's broadly a good argument. There's obviously more to be said about here. And this is one of the parts that I wanted to review here. So specifically, we're looking at the idea of the incarnation. So Jesus is supposed to be God and man at the same time, fully man and fully God simultaneously. But man and God have wildly inconsistent properties, obviously. So this is just a simple contradiction, right? Now, I want to suggest that if this belief was present in any other religion, and to my knowledge, it isn't. Like, Hinduism has this idea of incarnation, but it's not the same theologically, at least as I understand it. But anyway, if this specific doctrine about being fully man and fully God was present in any other religion, Christians would laugh at it and reject it on the face of it. I mean, you can see these examples with Mormonism, Joseph Smith claims to have uncovered these gold plates that were preserved from ancient Israelites who moved to the Americas. That's pretty ridiculous, right? But there's nothing that seems obviously on the face of it logically impossible about that. It's just very implausible historically and maybe theologically as well. But, one could give many other examples. But I think it's a blind spot that Christians don't see, or at least most of them don't see. They don't see how patently absurd some of these doctrines are. And they'll make fun of also absurd, but plausibly not as absurd doctrines, not obviously logically contradictory doctrines that other traditions have or believe. And but then be in this sort of smug position about, the TikTok answer, to this TikTok question, which we all know is, kind of silly and ignores all of the nuance that we've thought about for the last 2,000 years. I don't know. It just rubs me the wrong way. I think you should, and to be fair, some Christians do this, that you should just be honest and say this doctrine is kind of whacked. It doesn't really make any sense, but we believe it on faith or whatever. You can come up with different models. We'll talk about that, I think, a little bit. But I think it's a bit, there should be more honesty here about how patently absurd on the face of it is that someone can be fully man and fully God at the same time. Well, yes, he's a particle in a wave. Funny you should mention that, Gary.
Yeah, maybe we can put it this way. Here's a question for you. Was Jesus infinite or finite? And the answer is yes.
So, he's presenting that as a joke, but that kind of is apparently what Christians believe, or a lot of Christians at least. And that's just ridiculous. How can he be finite and infinite at the same time? Well, there's excuses that one can come up with, and you can debate about their plausibility. But I think there needs to be a bit more humility here, to be honest. I guess it comes across as a bit condescending to say that, but when you're advocating for a doctrine like this, and it's infinite and finite at the same time. I don't know. A bit more self-awareness would be good, but let's see what he has to say about it.
What we find in the New Testament is a consistent pattern. This isn't about us.
By the way, this book here, Christian Apologetics by Gruthius, I have that book. I don't think I have it on me here, but terrible book, by the way. I might do some reviews of it sometime.
Pitting some verses against other verses or taking certain texts out of context. We see a consistent pattern throughout the New Testament, in the Gospels and in what the epistles say about Jesus as well, that he has very human attributes. He's very much a man. He has the typical things going on with a human being, like eating and drinking and sleeping. And on the other hand, we find...
You didn't mention the ones that the Muslims have the biggest problem with. What happens after you do the eating and drinking, at the other end? Muslims, I think, the way they think about God is quite different. And I think they have some plausible... it's sort of interesting, right? Because Muslims at least many Muslims, think that it's completely on the face of it, absolutely absurd that God would ever defecate or something like that. They just think that that's so far beyond what's reasonable and inconsistent with the nature of God and all that. And Christians, I guess because they're just used to the idea of God incarnate, they just have absolutely no problem with this, and they don't see the issue. But then they have a huge issue with, say, Mormons, who reject the traditional notion of the Trinity. And parenthetically, I have a hot take there that I actually think that the Mormon views of God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit are very, very similar to the traditional Trinity. Wording is different, but like the substance of it is very, very similar. But anyway, in parentheses. But that is like what drives, mainstream Christian crazy. It's like, oh, this idea that there's three gods instead of one, where we believe in the one that is three, but it's one at the same time. Like, the point I'm making is here, what people regard as plausible, implausible to believe about God theologically seems to be just so overwhelmingly culturally shaped by their experiences and what they're used to. And the intuitions that people develop just have, it seems to me, no real weight at all. Like, just completely useless for telling us about like what actually is plausible or reasonable or sensible. Because, like I said, because it just seems to be shaped by what cultural assumptions you bring to the question. And I think that there needs to be more acknowledgement of this, that when we're addressing these questions, we can't just make these assumptions and take things for granted that seem plausible to us. I mean, this harkens back to what I was talking about, Larry, right? It's just a complete lack of concern about the cultural and personal psychological biases or perspectives or background assumptions that you make and how those color the way you look at things. And this is what real skepticism is, by the way. Like, part of it is trying to compensate for those and trying to work around those. But a lot of these philosophical and theological arguments, as well as like bad biblical interpretation, just kind of forgets about that or makes a superficial appearance of engaging with that, but doesn't really. So anyway, I'm getting a bit off topic here, but I think that this is important when you're thinking about these questions, is that, like, if all you're trying to do is give an answer that feels right to you, then that's like super easy to do, because you just, rattle off some platitudes that people say in your tradition and seem reasonable. And then like you're done. It's like, you tell your fan fiction that everyone reinforces you about, and it's all good. Like, it makes sense to you. Like, if that's all the goal is, then it's really easy to achieve. But I think that that's not good philosophy. That's not good. That's not real skepticism, and that's not how you actually learn about things or achieve, genuine knowledge or wisdom.
Find Jesus showing characteristics or attributes that just don't belong to human beings. They belong to God. And it's not just, oh, we found a verse over here that says Jesus is human, but now there's a verse over there yonder that says Jesus is God. No, we're talking about very often in the very same context. We see Jesus' humanity and deity displayed simultaneously or instant, one right after the other. So Jesus is asleep in the boat with the disciples on the Sea of Galilee, and a big storm whips up, and the disciples wake Jesus up, and they say, "Don't you care? We're dying here." I imagine Jesus probably stretched and yawned, like most people would. But it says that he stood up and took a look at the storm and said, "Shut up," and it did. Now, on the one hand, Jesus is obviously human. He's a man. He's asleep in the boat. On the other hand, people just don't tell storms to shut up and have it happen. There's something odd here. And the disciples' response confirms this. The disciples' response was, "Who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him?" So the Christian doctrine of the Incarnation, which is what we started off, what is that? What does that mean? It says something about Jesus that's very puzzling. It says that he has the characteristics of both God and man, that he is a divine person who condescended to take our human nature on himself. Without ceasing to be God, he experienced fully our mortal humanity, even to the point of suffering, temptations, never sinning though, and dying on the cross. Jesus experienced the full force of the limitations and the degradations of human nature. He suffered, he died. And yet, Jesus could say things like, "No one can take my life away from me. I lay it down of my own."
So just remember that this is in response to a question in which he's supposed to give a TikTok length answer about how it is that Jesus can be like fully God or fully man, like infinite and finite at the same time. And we basically just degenerate into a sermon at this point, just, rattling off Christian. I mean, he's asking some questions within it, right? But then he's just sort of asserting the Christian position. It's like, well, he's fully God and fully man. Like he, condescended to take our position. He was tempted but never sinned, and all this sort of stuff. This is how you disguise a just sort of sermonizing as giving an actual answer. Like, you don't actually answer the question. You just reiterate the things that Christians are supposed to believe. I mean, I've encountered this myself. Like, you ask a question and then they just basically tell you, like, how can Jesus be fully God and fully man at the same time? Now, if they just responded by saying, well, because he is fully God and man at the same time, that would be a bit transparent, right? So they don't do that. they give you like a 5-10 minute sermon where they make these references to places like Bible passages and to various concepts in Christian theology and flowery phrases, thought terminating cliches and blah, 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 put it all together, things that Christians have heard before. But the content of it is just reasserting the thing that you've asked about. There's no actual substance to it. There's no explanation there. I'm not saying there can't be, but I'm saying a lot of the times this is what happens. It just turns into a sermon, which just restates the thing that you asked. But it gives a sort of, if you're not paying attention, it gives the superficial impression of having some gravitas, some substance to it, some actual analysis, when in fact there is little to any. I mean, other people in chat have probably experienced what I'm talking about here. When you ask a question, you get kind of a mini sermon in response, and you realize, maybe you don't even realize immediately. Like, may depend on where you're at, but especially if you're well disposed towards the person, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And maybe you realize they didn't say anything that I didn't already know. Like, they just restated the question as a series of assertions. And we're just seeing that here. I mean, he does have a bit more to say later on, but he's supposed to be giving a concise answer here.
Own accord. This is why I came here, why the Father sent me, so that I could lay my life down and take it back again. Well, people don't have that power to prevent other people from killing them. You can't be sure of that. Maybe if you're a really strong person, you can escape most of the time, but eventually death will catch up with you. But Jesus said, I lay it down of my own accord. Peter said something very interesting in his sermon at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. He said that it was impossible for death to keep hold on Jesus. He couldn't stay dead. Not because God arbitrarily decided to raise him from the dead, but because Jesus is life incarnate. Jesus said in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He told Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. John says in John...
Just full on sermon mode here. Like, we're not even pretending to answer the question at this point. I think he's probably lost track of the question.
1:4, in him was life. Jesus is life incarnate. So he couldn't be killed without agreeing to it and laying his life down and relinquishing that life. And he couldn't stay dead because he is life itself. And so we see these paradoxes, is the term that I like. These apparent discrepancies.
By the way, if it's true that Jesus couldn't be killed without his consent, then that means he wasn't fully human, at least as far as I'm concerned, because, well, that's not how humans work. No human has the ability to just not die if they don't feel like it. Anyway, just a little thing I thought of.
There are apparent contradictions, at least on a two-dimensional level as we look at it. Jesus is
immortal,
life itself, and yet he died. Jesus is omnipotent, and yet he fell asleep in the boat. These apparent contradictions.
This is actually a good point. I am also life incarnate. What is he? WH is he talking about? Yeah, well, your life, but maybe not life. Like, you're not capital L life incarnate. I don't know. Doing my best here.
Are not just randomly found in the New Testament, and we're trying to make excuses. Rather, we see, such as in that account of Jesus stilling the storm, that Jesus is himself a paradoxical person. He unites in himself divine attributes and human attributes. Now, what is that like? I don't know.
Okay, so here's the actual answer to the question. Let me just jump back a second. So we had that huge waffle preamble, which didn't answer the question. The question was, how can Jesus have these contradictory or seemingly contradictory attributes at the same time of being divine and being human? Here's the actual answer to that question.
Person. He unites in himself divine attributes and human attributes. Now, what is that like?
Here's the answer.
I don't know. I'm not one of those types of persons. The only person who's ever been God incarnate is Christ. So there's paradoxes, there's mysteries, but there's also sense and rationality.
Okay, so the answer is he doesn't know. And that's a fair answer. I'm a big fan of people saying they don't know when they don't know and not making up some BS. If only it would sort of sort of ended there. But now, of course, I'm not saying that Christians literally have nothing to say about this issue. There are various models for how the incarnation is supposed to work. I do want to cover this in more detail in future videos. I don't really get the sense that any of them are sort of widely agreed upon. But like, at least what Rob is telling us here is that he's not defending anything very particular, or at least he's not doing so when answering that question. Like the TikTok, and this is how it was framed, like the TikTok question is, how does Jesus have these seemingly contradictory attributes? The answer is he doesn't know. Okay, well, from my point of view, that's a reason to not be a Christian then. Like, I'm not saying it's a sufficient reason. You may have other reasons to be a Christian, but like if a central doctrine doesn't make any damn sense, then that counts against it. Like the way that logic and rationality and evidence usually works is that when you have this big fat central thing that doesn't make any damn sense, that kind of counts against believing in whatever that thing is. Now maybe there's countervailing considerations that swamp that. Sure, that's always a possibility, but at least it counts against. But I think that a lot of what we're going to hear, I don't know, we'll get through the whole video, but a lot of what we're going to hear is just sort of excuses as to why that's okay. And we sort of started to hear that already, that it's like, but there's sense in it too. Okay, well, what sense is there in it?
To it. The way I approach this and the way this is laid out in the book is, hypothetically, if God the Son, fully divine in all of his nature, if he were to become man, what would we expect to find in the New Testament? What would we expect to find in the Gospels? Would we expect to find a person that made perfectly good sense to us? Oh yeah, sure, that's how life is for people, and that's how life is for Jesus, if he's just as if he were just a man. Or he's God, so he's floating off the ground and he never has to eat. And no, we wouldn't expect that. If God became man, we would expect something we never heard of before or something.
So this is an incredibly stupid response, in my opinion. Okay, so we're actually talking about a very strong claim here, which is that Jesus, as presented in the Gospels, is logically contradictory. Like there's contradictory properties, infinite and finite, like man and God, all-knowing and yet finite, all these other things, right, that he talked about. So responding to that by saying, well, let's suppose that existed, and what would we see, or what would it be like? That's like asking, well, look, let's suppose that a square circle existed. What would it be like? Well, it wouldn't be like anything because it's impossible. Like you can't even imagine it because it's a contradiction. and that's essentially what is occurring here. Like, what does a finite infinite look like? Well, it doesn't look like anything. It's not possible. Like it's not imaginable. You might even trick yourself into thinking you imagine it, but you're wrong because it doesn't make sense. Something can't be finite and infinite in the same sense at the same time. It just doesn't work that way. And yet Rob here is trying to defend the idea of a finite infinite, essentially, by saying, well, look, suppose it existed. It would be weird, right? So therefore, we shouldn't be surprised to see that the Jesus has presented in the Gospels is kind of weird and doesn't make sense if you think about it. This is just such a ridiculous response. Like, just think that you can defend absolutely anything using this logic. Well, Your Honor, I know all of the evidence points to me being guilty, but look, think about it this way. Imagine that I was innocent and there was a huge conspiracy against me. Like, this is exactly what we would expect to see. So therefore, I contend that I'm in fact innocent and there's this huge conspiracy, or it's, it's all a coincidence or whatever. Like, literally, this is conspiracy theory logic. Oh, yes, I know that there's evidence against the conspiracy, but that's all part of the conspiracy. And if it was part of the conspiracy, this is exactly what you'd expect to see. Huh? There's no sense of plausibility here, essentially. Or consistency with other beliefs that we have. It's all just make-believe. And this is why I say it fits into, this is why I wanted to do these two videos together, because it's kind of part of the same approach. It's basically just make-believe. It's like, well, look, imagine it was true. Then it would be like this, right? And so it kind of makes sense that it is this way. And so it makes sense to me, so I'm just going to accept it. Utter nonsense. Like, that is not how you approach anything intellectually. You don't just assume it exists, and then because you can take an assumption as a working hypothesis, like, okay, suppose this is true, what follows from that? The problem with this is that when you're making an assumption that on the outset is impossible, and then asking, well, what would the result be, you just get nonsense. And then but then Rob then concludes from that, yeah, we do get nonsense, and that's what is found in the Gospels, so therefore it makes sense. Like, it matches. It's nonsense and nonsense, and nonsense and nonsense somehow support each other. That's just absolutely whacked. Absolutely whacked.
Before, and we can't fully grasp or understand how he can be what he is. And that's what we see throughout the Gospels, that Jesus is this paradox.
Yeah, this is a good point as well. Jesus's life isn't like a real person's life, and they completely skip his childhood, at least in the canonical Gospels. I think that there's some discussion of this in other Gospels, but they completely skip his childhood and adolescence, because it's just, what would a child be like who just never does anything wrong, even by accident or through lack of knowledge? Like, that's just absurd, and no one would take that seriously. And it wouldn't be realistic. It wouldn't feel real. And yeah, I think that's a good observation, that the idea that you have this sort of sinless person who actually was born and then grows up and does all of the things that a normal person does is just not believable. Like, it's just not how humans are. And so the best you can do is, with Jesus being this like quite cryptic character, like, he's very unclear about how he thinks of himself. And by the way, I don't think that Jesus was invented in the Gospels, right? I think it was based on a real person, but he's been substantially mythologized, essentially, based on later Christian understandings. And in order to present that in a way that makes even the slightest bit of sense or seems slightly plausible, you have to kind of have a distance to it. It's kind of like the idea of never meet your heroes, right? Because you see because there's always a difference between your expectations and your mental image of something and the reality of it. And the reality is never quite as good. There's always imperfections. There's always things you didn't anticipate. And so I think that what we see of Jesus in the Gospels is precisely this sort of relative distance figure. Like, you never really, there's no first person monologue of Jesus, for example. He never wrote anything himself. You hear him preaching and giving miracles and interacting with people, but like there's not a lot of him. You don't get his home life. You don't get his adolescence. You don't see how he deals with his mother very much. Things like this, right? I think there's a couple of interactions, but like, there's a lot of things that are absent from a real, like if you were actually writing a biography of someone, for example, and presenting them in a realistic way, you just don't get that with Jesus, at least I would argue. Anyway, and so, but that's essential to maintain the kind of facade that like you could actually have a perfect human being who was like fully and actually a human being, but somehow also perfect.
Person. And that's really at the heart of what the incarnation means. It means that God, the divine Son of God, came into the flesh, experienced our finite limitations as human beings, lived through that, died with that for our sake, so that we might have immortal life in him.
Rob, it's going to be hard for me to put that whole response into one social media video response.
Because it isn't a response. The response, the best we got was, well, look, I agree, it doesn't make sense and we can't understand it, but just think, if it were true, it wouldn't make sense, would it? So, think about that. That's the substance of it. So it's basically just like, if my fan fiction were real, then it wouldn't make sense. And it doesn't, in fact, make sense. So, it's exactly how I predicted.
I'm giving you a hard time, but in one sense, we shouldn't expect to do that. I saw a debate of an atheist and a Christian friend of mine, and the atheist was like, hey, put the Trinity, where's one verse that teaches the Trinity? And, my friend tried, but I remember thinking about it going, why should we expect there to be one verse? I would challenge the assumption. Yeah. We're talking about the triune character of the eternal God who reveals himself in scripture from beginning to end. We shouldn't expect it in one verse, shouldn't expect it in one social media video.
Okay, so if God is the eternal and all-loving and all-knowing and all-powerful being who created the universe and dearly wants to communicate his nature to us so that we can understand and take appropriate measures to secure our eternal salvation, maybe you could have put that in one verse. Like you could have put his nature in one verse. Maybe it's a longer verse, okay, but like, isn't that what you'd expect? Isn't this what you see when you have systematic theology textbooks that they like kind of organize things and put clear definitions and like categorize, and this just isn't how the Bible is. Like, so I don't understand. Why would we not expect that? That seems exactly what you would expect. If a good and capable teacher dearly wants to communicate something to his pupils, he says it concisely and clearly, and then maybe there's explanation after, right? But you say it very clearly and concisely. You don't put a piece here and a piece there and a piece over here and then expect people over hundreds of years to like haphazardly glue them together and have a whole host of debates and heresies and all that in order to get there. Like, what kind of an omnipotent being does things that way? Like, God is just an absolute hack if this is how he goes about things. Now, of course, it's possible to make excuses. Like, well, he has other purposes that you can't even imagine. Okay, well, I think that if you're going to go down that line, that's a reason to then discount a lot of other arguments for God's existence, because a lot of those appeal to his reasons for doing things, but that's getting a bit off track. But the point is, I think that this is a very bad argument here, that, look, you wouldn't expect God to be clear and concise, would you, about important things? Kind of would, though. Like, kind of would. Like, I don't know. I expect that of people who are trying to communicate something important. I don't know why I expect that of God, given he's supposed to be so far above us. Who knows? He could do anything, I suppose.
But to me, a helpful illustration, and this wasn't unique to me, a lot of people talk about how light is like a wave and a particle. We don't know how to make sense of this. There's a tension, a paradox that's there. It's not a contradiction, but it's a paradox. And if we see that in science, we should not be surprised to see it in theology either. That's the way the world is. Now, with that said,
go ahead.
Tell me what you think about that.
Here, the scientists, the physicists, debated for like a century whether light was a wave or a particle. And they had, the ones that said it was a wave had good evidence. The ones that said it was a particle had good evidence. And eventually they said, you know what? It's kind of both. And they made up a word, wavical, to describe it. Well, that doesn't actually solve the problem, but it expresses it. And frankly, the word incarnation does something similar. It's a label that we use.
So this example here, which someone actually mentioned in chat, is entirely idiotic. Because here's what didn't happen. So no one actually thought it made any sense to say that light was both a wave and a particle in the same sense at the same time. And, well, look, there's a lot of bad popularization of quantum mechanics, so I need to be cautious here, but no one who knows what they're talking about would say that today either. What the correct statement is that we now have a superseded understanding of the nature of light, and in fact, other, well, I'm going to say particles, but like electrons and other things as well, because it's they're all like this. We now have an understanding that supersedes previous understandings of wave or particle as a dichotomy, because we now have a richer conceptual understanding. And I think the better way to say it is that in some contexts, say photons, or light behaves classically like a particle, and in other contexts, it behaves classically like a wave, or so I should say like a classical wave, like a classical particle. But it isn't actually either of those things. It's, in fact, contested as to what the ultimate ontological nature of quantum mechanics is. Like, there's wave and particle interpretations. I lean to a wave interpretation myself, so I'd probably say that, like, say a photon is a partly localized wave packet in an underlying electromagnetic field, which propagates through space-time. And then, with certain quantum mechanical interactions, it interacts apparently as a point particle. And that's part of what we don't understand very well about quantum mechanics, is we don't understand that whole process of like interaction, the collapse or measurement events. But anyway, it's getting a bit off track. The point is, yeah, there are some things we don't understand there, but what we don't do is just, and what physicists and philosophers have not done, have just sort of stopped and said, yeah, actually it's a wave and a particle at the same time, and that's the end of the story. No, in fact, what we have is a much richer understanding, where we recognize that wave and particle are sort of loose metaphors, really, for understanding what the reality is. And we don't have a full understanding of that yet, but we can describe it, and this is also a key point, we can describe it rigorously mathematically, at least most aspects of it. I mean, the measurement process is sort of not theorized well, but anyway, getting off track here. Now, none of that is true. Notice that absolutely none of that is true with respect to the statement being made here about Jesus. It's the Christians who are telling us that Jesus is both man and God, like infinite and finite, at the same time. Physicists aren't saying that. They're saying that sometimes light behaves like a wave and sometimes it behaves like a particle. That is decidedly not. In fact, I think that's a heresy, right? I don't remember the name of it. That's a heresy to say, like, sometimes Jesus is God and sometimes he's a man, or in some respects he's a God and in some respects he's a man. No. He is in like a totality in both, right? So that's one difference. And another difference is that our understanding of the nature of light, its quantum mechanical nature, has developed tremendously since these initial questions about wave versus particle. I don't know that that's true of the theology of the Incarnation. And thirdly, we know that light behaves in some ways like a wave and a particle, that those are at least aspects of its behavior, because we have very strong empirical evidence of those behaviors. None of that's true with respect to any of this theology. So it's a completely inapt analogy. The only aspect in which you can say it's similar is, well, look, sometimes we need multiple descriptions of something in order to fully characterize it. Like, if you describe a photon as a wave, that misses certain characteristics like interference patterns. If you describe it as a particle, wrong way around. If you describe it as a particle, you miss certain phenomena like interference patterns. If you describe it as a wave, you miss certain interactions, phenomena like the absorption of energy levels in an electron as discrete, or things like that. Energy levels in an atom as discrete. And so you kind of need both metaphors to understand the thing properly. But that doesn't actually seem to be what's happening at all in the Jesus case, where it's not an issue of like, well, metaphorically, he's like man in some ways and God in other ways. Like, it's supposed to be literally true. And this is where there just isn't anything else to say. Like, it's just a contradiction. So I don't think they actually understand appropriately, like properly, what that wave particle duality is supposed to be about. Apparently there are heresies called modalism. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but that sounds plausible to me. I have heard of that name before. Anyway, no, it's not modalism. I'm getting conflicting reports here. Well, but I'm pretty sure there's some heresy about that. Like, wasn't this like the monophysites thought that God had only one nature, but that he has actually two natures? That's like man and God. I don't know. Like, I don't remember all. There's too many heresies to keep track of. But it took centuries to work out all this stuff, and like a lot of people died and suffered because of it. Then, if just God could have been a bit clearer, maybe we could have avoided some of these issues.
To express the idea that Jesus is this paradoxical person who's both divine and human. It doesn't explain it. It doesn't make it easy to understand, but it lets us know that something is happening here that may catch us off guard and may be surprising. And we learn more about Christ by accepting both aspects of his person, his incarnation, than if we deny one or the other.
Wavical sounds to me like a certain kind of popsicle. But,
Yes.
I digress on that one. Now, last question, though. We're going to take each of these five one by one, is I hear this all the time, is people say, why didn't Jesus just say, I am God and settle it? Now, before you answer that, people who are watching, we're about to go through Rob Bowman's case for the deity of Jesus and what I consider to be the newest and most definitive book, The Incarnate Christ and His Critics. We've got 5 key points we're going to discuss, but please write down your challenges, your questions, write question in caps, state it as succinctly as possible, and we will come back Friday and address your toughest questions. So if you want to share this with someone who's a Latter-day Saint, a Jehovah's Witness, a Muslim, anybody else, a Oneness Pentecostal, a liberal Christian, and say, hey, watch this and you prove these guys wrong, give us your toughest question. We want to address it and steel man those positions if we can. Rob, why didn't Jesus just say, obviously he didn't speak English, I understand that, but in the language of the time, why didn't he just make it simple and say, here's what the incarnation is, I accomplished it, I am God?
Well, it's interesting, before I give a direct answer to that question, to point out that Jesus also
always freaking do this. They always do this when you ask them questions like this. Them, I don't know, apologists, biblical scholars, theologians, whatever. 99% of the time, you ask them a clear, direct question, and then it's, well, before I answer that, I'm going to waffle on for 5 minutes about all this other crap that makes everyone kind of forget what the initial question was, and then I'm going to dodge answering it or give an answer that doesn't actually really address the core issue. Well, why can't we just give clear, concise answers? Maybe it's this conditioning of reading the Bible, which rarely gives clear, concise answers, to like not just give clear and concise answers. I understand that sometimes you can't give all the complexity in, a 30-second answer. But what you can do is you can give the summary of that and then expand. You don't have to give all of this preamble, which distracts from things. It makes it seem like you don't actually have an answer. Give the short answer and then elaborate, especially when someone asks you a question like in a concise and direct way, like, please give me a direct answer. It's very frustrating. It's just because it makes it so hard to pin them down on like, but what is your actual answer on this issue? And then they just run out the time in whatever the debate or dialogue is. I see it all the time. It's not restricted to apologists, obviously, but it's really frustrating. It's just a way of dodging. It makes it seem like you have an answer, but politicians do as well, but you actually just don't answer the question. You just say a bunch of stuff that's vaguely related.
also never said, I am the Messiah. That's really surprising to many people. They assume that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. He did things and said things that made it clear that he was, but Jesus never said, I am the Messiah. And we can find maybe one place in the Gospel of John where Jesus said, I am the Son of God. And so we'd have to point out that all of the other views that claim that they know who Jesus is have the same problem. Nowhere does Jesus say, I'm Michael the Archangel, for example. So the question may not even be a proper question, because the Gospels do not present Jesus as speaking in the first person directly about his identity or who he is in that kind of this will settle it manner. He just doesn't do it, regardless of what you think Jesus was or who he was. He doesn't do that. Now, why didn't he do it? Why did he avoid giving a direct answer to this kind of question? Well, partly because it's a post-biblical question. It's a question we're asking afterwards. That's not what people were asking then. They were puzzled by him, but they weren't saying, well, are you God or aren't you? It just.
Well, I'm pretty sure they were interested in whether he was the Messiah. And doesn't I don't know. I don't want to go into that. Yeah, certainly people were interested in whether he was the Messiah, because there were many Messiah claimants. So I don't think people claiming to be God was very common, but claiming to be the Messiah wasn't that uncommon. So I don't think that actually answers the question posed. People weren't really asking that question. Well, they were asking about the Messiah.
That comes up later. What Jesus does is
and I'm pretty sure he is directly asked that by like the Pharisees at one point or something. Like, is he the Messiah? I don't know. I don't remember exactly what the question was.
In a humble form, as a lowly human being, no royal robes, no entourage, he just comes as a regular guy, and he when he does things or says things that reveal his deity, he does it's indirect. It's always maybe a little bit at an angle or oblique that he's claiming divinity in what he says, or that he's showing divine powers in what he does. And why does he do it that way? Because nobody in Jesus' own day has the framework or the apparatus of belief and understanding to be able to have any comprehension if Jesus were to try to explain in a direct fashion who he was.
Okay, well, for a start, they had a comprehension of the Messiah. So we could have said, I am the Messiah. And I think they would have understood that. Now, here's my take on, I don't know exactly what Jesus did or did not say, right? I suspect that he didn't claim directly to be God, and probably wasn't as direct as it indicates in, like, John, for example. I suspect that was added later. But what's interesting is that you do get this sense that Jesus likes this sort of plausible deniability. And it's like, well, I never actually said I was the Messiah. Like, sure, a bunch of people are saying that I'm the Messiah, but I never said that. Like, am I the Messiah? Well, look, that's for you to think about. Like, but I, and then he does healings, or, he's reported to have, done healings and other things like that, and makes these proclamations. I could forgive sin. That's another example. Like, who can forgive sin but God alone? To To me, it sounds like a politician's answer. Like, well, there's plausible deniability. Like, you imply something but don't directly say it, so that when challenged, you can like walk it back. I don't actually think that that's a virtue. Like, I think that this is cowardice of a form. Like, if you're going to present yourself as being something, come out and say that. Like, it's not like he's on an undercover operation or something that he needs to hide. Well, I don't know. Maybe that's what Rob's implying. That doesn't make any sense to me. It's supposed to be God's message to the world. Why is he hiding this? It doesn't make any sense. No, I think it's because obviously I think that Jesus was a man only and not God. I think that he probably was a bit coy about what he said. Obviously, because if he was too upfront, he would have just been stoned to death, and that would have been the end of it. So he had to, and the Gospels do present that as a risk. But I think that he was smart enough to be, somewhat evasive and somewhat indirect about what he claimed about himself. At least often, maybe not in 100% of cases, but like enough so that that got him out of trouble for at least, some amount of time. So that's actually my answer, which I think makes a lot of sense because we know that people do that. Now, if the God of the universe was to come down and present himself as as having a special message and being kind of a sacrifice to for all of humanity, I don't know why he would do this sort of plausible deniability, coyness, like am I or aren't I kind of thing. The excuse here that, people just wouldn't have understood him. Well, first of all, like what he did is even less clear. So I don't know why that's an improvement. But second of all, yeah, they would have understood him claiming to be the Messiah. Like they absolutely had that concept. So that's just wrong.
There's no concept of the Trinity. I know some people are trying to argue that there was, but there really wasn't. God was one. It didn't preclude the Trinity necessarily, but it didn't, proclaim it. They didn't know anything about a pre-existent Son or a pre-existent and distinct person of the Holy Spirit. They didn't have those concepts to draw upon. Jesus couldn't just say, well, that thing in the Old Testament about the Son being existent from all, before creation, that's me. No, there's no context for him to do that. So
all of that is evidence against Jesus being the Messiah, by the way, because he doesn't fit into existing theological frameworks very well at all. It's all ad hoc, constructed after the fact to justify what happened to Jesus, particularly him dying when he wasn't supposed to. So this was all invented after the fact to make sense. It's all fan fiction. Like all of this stuff is fan fiction. I mean, you could say, well, isn't the Old Testament as well? But if you take that as like the basis, everything else, like in the theology that comes about Jesus being God incarnate and the Trinity and all this sort of stuff, as well as the atonement, all of that's fan fiction invented after the fact to justify why it is that the Messiah was killed instead of restoring Israel and becoming king and bringing about the end times prefiguring the end times and all of this sort of stuff that was supposed to happen that was actually prophesied in the Old Testament. And Rob is just admitting that, like he's just saying, yeah, none of this was understood. No one had these concepts. And for some reason, the apologists also appeal to these sorts of considerations when defending the resurrection. Somehow they think that if they show that Jesus didn't fulfill any of the prophecy, they don't say that. They think that if they can show that Jesus, what happened to Jesus was completely incomprehensible and unexpected with respect to previous Jewish beliefs about the Messiah, that therefore somehow that makes it more likely that Jesus was the Messiah. Again, I don't know how you jump through that many mental hoops to get yourself in that position where you claim that Jesus was the Messiah, but also like was completely different to what everyone thought the Messiah would be. Conditioning on the scriptures that you were sort of supposed to be building on. That just, to me, seems obviously that you've just made that up after the fact. And in fact, it doesn't fit what was expected at the time. And so that's very strong evidence that it's against. But then somehow Christians will say, oh, it's ridiculous that Joseph Smith could have brought forth a new scripture because that's not what we expect from the Bible. Like, what are you talking about? Like that? This is what I mean. Like, it's just an inability to see things from an outsider's point of view and to engage like reasonably about what things are actually plausible and not plausible. It's just because you're used to it, it seems plausible. Like this seems to be absolutely infusing everything that's being discussed here, and an inability to see like, this point you're making about the fact that no one understood anything about what Jesus, what allegedly was happening with Jesus theologically, like that actually counts against this plausibility as an extension of the Old Testament. Like, kind of seems like it's entirely what you'd expect if people just made it up all after the fact to justify their expectations being shattered. But there's no ability to see that because they're just so used to thinking in these contexts.
What Jesus does is he shows who he is by the way he acts, by the things he does, by the way he talks. And after his resurrection, his disciples are able to see clearly in retrospect what he was doing and what he was saying and what it meant. But
Monday morning quarterbacking. I'm presuming you're familiar with that expression. They were able to see clearly in hindsight. Everyone's able to see clearly in hindsight, my man. That is much more consistent with the hypothesis that this was all made up after the fact to justify what happened, rather than that this was actually all planned from the beginning. I mean, of course, if it did, the thing is, prophecies are tricky things because if the prophecy was known to be made beforehand by the person by the person allegedly fulfilling the prophecy, then they could have potentially shaped events for it to go the way they wanted to. On the other hand, if the prophecy was sort of invented after the fact, well, then it's easy to make up the prophecy to fit what happened. So either way, it's kind of a problem. In order for this really to be useful, you need to ensure that the prophecy was one that couldn't be fulfilled by design, like by someone trying to fulfill it, essentially. And, there's potential ways you can do that. But the point I'm making is in the case of Jesus, it seems obvious that all of the alleged things that were consistent or like the theological framework was just all made up after the fact. Because it was all, it was obvious in hindsight. Yeah, but the problem is that what the disciples couldn't control was the fact that Jesus was killed before he fulfilled all of the things that the Messiah was supposed to do. That was outside their control. And that's not something that they could just concoct to be different. And so they had to come up with some explanation. And what we get is, like, the best they could come up with was this nonsense about the atonement and the Trinity and the Incarnation, none of which make a lick of sense. Yes, I know that Christians will be upset at me saying that, but I'm going to say that. I'll be talking more about that in coming episodes, but partly that's what we're looking at here. These doctrines, I don't think, make any sense. They can't be defended rationally with any plausibility. And the reason that the Christians are stuck with them is because they have to provide some explanations to why Jesus was killed. He can't just be a failed Messiah claimant. And so that's why it doesn't fit with anything that went before, because it was all hindsight. It's all Monday morning quarterbacking.
There was no context for them to be able to understand it until he had died and risen from the dead. Now, by the way, this is a testament to the historical credibility and authenticity of the Gospels. If the Gospels are fiction made up after the fact to put into the mouth of Jesus, even messianic claims or divine claims, it's odd that they never have him do so directly.
Okay, well, they do in John, though. Like, he directly claims to be God in John. So we have at least one case of that. But as to the other ones, well, yeah, that is interesting. But the thing is that this is a false dichotomy. That the dichotomy is between Gospels were just made up completely out of whole cloth with absolutely no historical basis at all by someone wanting to make a theological point, and Gospels were completely reliable based on eyewitness testimony being reported objectively and accurately. Now, I sit closer to the made up out of whole cloth, but I don't say that they were actually made up out of whole cloth. I do think that there is genuine historical information in the Gospels that does reflect some of the teachings and actions of Jesus and some of the understandings that evolved from those. But it's not just this simple, right? It means that the way I would interpret this is that how the disciples understood Jesus was as someone who was a bit coy and didn't make these direct pronouncements, apart from John, apparently, who was wanting to make that theological point so much, apparently, that he just kind of got a bit carried away. But at least the synoptic Gospels don't do that, and that's evidently the understanding they had of Jesus. I don't think you can just say, oh, well, they definitely would have inserted all these things. Like, we know that people did, right? Because with the non-canonical Gospels, there's some much more elaborate theological claims and symbologies, like the one with I forget which one it is. Is it the Gospel of Peter that has like the cross that it talks and walks off or something? I might have got that confused, but like, it's some really wacky stuff, even wackier. I mean, so, the Matthew, where it has the corpses all getting up and walking around Jerusalem, that's pretty wacky. But anyway, the point is that you have to ask serious, careful questions about who wrote the Gospels, why they wrote them, and what their understanding was of Jesus, and not just make these blind assumptions about, oh, well, they would have put this in or they wouldn't have put that in. Like, you don't know unless you know their particular context. And what we can't do is make this simplistic dichotomy between, oh, it's all made up completely from whole cloth, or it has, or it's all completely reliable and objective. Not true. Like, literally nothing is like that. Well, okay, some things are just made up of whole cloth, although even those are usually built on some idea, like they're developed from some pre-existing ideas, right? And certainly nothing is wholly completely objective. There's almost always somewhere in between, right? But this is the common straw man false dichotomy that you get from apologists trying to defend the New Testament, because they'll basically set up a straw man as like, you think that it's completely and utterly made up from absolutely nothing just to make theological points with no historical basis at all. And yeah, there are some people who argue that, but I don't think that's correct. I think that that's pretty implausible position, and they'll knock that down, and then they'll say, well, given that we've knocked that down, the alternative is that it must be wholly and completely reliable and objective. And that's what we've seen here.
Instead, they have Jesus even telling people who guess that he's somebody important, don't tell anybody what you've heard, what you know. When Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," Jesus says, "Okay, now go tell everybody." No, he doesn't do that. He says, "Don't tell anybody." And one of the Gospels says, "Don't tell anybody this until the Son of Man has risen from the dead." And even there, he's referring to himself in the third person. So Jesus' strategy, if I could put it that way, is to show rather than just tell. He demonstrates who he is in ways that don't really make sense to people at the time until after he's died and risen from the dead and sent the Holy Spirit. And then it's all becoming clear to the disciples. But until that time, if Jesus had gone around saying, "I am God," or, oh my goodness, he would said, "Well, I'm the second person of the triune God. I'm a hypostatic."
Well, how about "I was the Messiah," right? Like, again, that would have made perfect sense. But apparently he mostly didn't do that.
Union of deity and humanity, he'd used later, Greek language or something. People would have gone, "Huh? What are you talking about?" So
Rob, what are you talking about? The Gospels show us repeatedly that the disciples didn't understand what Jesus was telling them. And so Rob is telling us that Jesus didn't make things clear because people wouldn't have understand. Instead, he made things unclear. And as a result, they didn't understand. Like, what are you on about, Rob? Like, this is a consistent theme of the Gospels, that the disciples don't understand what Jesus is talking about. Well, you can ask why that's there, but you can't say that Jesus made things unclear because if he made them clear, that people wouldn't have understood, and therefore he made them unclear, with the result that they still didn't understand. Like, that is just, what is that? That's nonsense. Welcome, Myth Vision, by the way.
So he doesn't do that. He simply shows who he is by the way he behaves and speaks, and later on people can see in retrospect what it all means.
Yeah, in retrospect. It's all in retrospect, right? And we still don't know what it means because we can't understand how a finite can be infinite, right? But even putting that aside, it's all in retrospect. It's all the Monday morning quarterbacking stuff. It's all the fan
Let's unpack that
fiction.
a little bit more and get to your acronym. And I see people quoting and citing. I've used it many times in my own talks and responses with people. It's so helpful because there's depth to it, but it's just with hands, HANDS. Each one indicates something unique about something Jesus said or did, affirming his deity. So let's start with the H, honors.
Yes. Now I want to give Ed Komashevsky full credit for this acronym. He came up with it before we started working on the book. He already had this as the outline of what he wanted to have in the book, and he had used it in class with students. So he had tested it, and it seems to be very helpful to people. So
it is.
Ed deserves all the credit for this. Now, the H stands for the word honors. It means that Jesus receives the same honors that God receives. So worship, prayer, reverence, or the fear of the Lord, all these kinds of divine honors that the Father receives, Jesus receives also. In fact, Jesus said in John 5:23 that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. So that kind of sums up the point there, that Jesus deserves and receives the honors that are due to God alone.
Okay, that's really helpful. So what follows from that? Like, did Jesus go around saying, "Give me this kind of honor"? Is this Paul later saying, "Here's a creed that was attributed to Jesus, but now, attributed to God in the Old Testament. Now it's attributed to Jesus"? Connect these dots for us.
Yeah, Jesus didn't demand divine honors during his lifetime. His statement that I just quoted in John 5:23 has to do with the future, that this is something that's going to happen, but not happening right then. Interestingly, people did come before Jesus, and in some cases knelt before him or bowed down before him. In the historical context, you could say, well, they're just showing respect to a revered teacher or something. But especially in Matthew, the language that's used makes it rather clear that Christians reading this afterwards are going to think, that guy was doing even better than he thought. He's showing Jesus a kind of respect that in retrospect we recognize he deserves in full.
It's all in retrospect. It's all, well, we can understand this in retrospect. Ah, jeez. I've already made the point there. We're just having a quick look at chat. I honestly am kind of lost by what's happening in chat, so forgive me if I don't always respond.
Full as God. But Jesus wasn't thought of as God during his earthly life. People weren't worshiping him in that way. But the language that Matthew uses in narrating it makes it pretty clear that we're to see this in retrospect. On the other hand, in some cases.
So how is this evidence that Jesus is God? This is evidence that Matthew thought he was God and is writing it in that way for us to understand. But how is that evidence that he actually was? Some guy later thought that that Jesus was God, or after the fact understood him as God. That's not evidence for anything. How
the worship is worship. So we mentioned earlier the demoniac falling before Jesus. Now this is cringing worship. He's afraid of him, but it's the reverence or an act of fear toward a feared divine being. At the end of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus meets the disciples on a mountaintop, and it says, when they saw him, they worshipped, but some doubted. Now this is not just showing respect to a teacher, because no one's going to doubt the legitimacy of doing that. They're probably doubting that they should be worshiping him. Is this okay? I mean, it feels like it's what we're supposed to do. But so Jesus' response to them is, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. That's Matthew 28:18. The worship is in verse 17. Well, the implication is you're right to worship me because I have universal sovereign authority over all of created existence. Now, if you don't worship someone who has that authority, who do you worship? I mean, that's pretty amazing. So
worship is an interesting notion. I'm sort of partial to the idea that worship is never an appropriate kind kind of response or relation to for an intelligent agent to have with respect to anything or anyone else, but that would require some defense that is best for another time. But anyway, it's a bit of an odd argument. It's like, well, you got to worship someone, and like this is the best candidate around, so like might as well worship him.
So Jesus has divine authority and is worthy of worship, but he doesn't get that from people, at least typically during his mortal lifetime. It's only after his resurrection that people very quickly start practicing a variety of acts of devotion to Jesus that Larry Hurtado called the Big Bang of Christology. Just all of a sudden, after Jesus' death and resurrection, the earliest Christians were worshiping and revering Jesus and showing him religious devotion in a variety of ways. And how does that happen? It's not something that evolved over decades or centuries. It happened right away.
Well, when you say right away, like, we're talking months to years. Like, we don't actually know. We have a timeline based on when Paul met with the disciples. It didn't happen like in one day. Well, maybe they would like to say that it did, but like months to years is not exactly all of a sudden. So I'm not sure actually how they establish what the timeline should be here. This is another common argument that apologists make about the resurrection. It's like, well, only a true divine appearance could have convinced people to change their mind in a period of like months to years, even though we see examples repeatedly of people changing their mind about things in a shorter time span than that. Just look at Larry in the previous episode. He like read the Bible for a few months in 2020, and then just sort of decided to believe because, I don't know, he enjoyed the fan fiction or whatever. Like, you know, I don't understand why this is supposed to be something that's inexplicable that people, well, anyway, I didn't even get into all that there. It's just a very weak argument.
This is really helpful because sometimes I think maybe Christians, myself included at times, have seen any indication of worshiping Jesus as a claim to deity, which some might be just showing respect and reverence for an authority. On the flip side, what Jehovah's Witnesses do is take away all of the worship of Jesus and say it's like just showing respect and authority. You argue in the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament, there are clear cases where they worship him as God, even if the apostles and others don't really understand it until they're looking back. Is that fair clarification?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, and note that this whole argument is predicated on, well, they didn't really understand what they were doing until looking at it in hindsight, which then opens up the question as to how do you know how reliable these reports are? Because these are allegedly they're written by people who were followers of Jesus or associates of Jesus or who knew associates of Jesus in hindsight decades later. So this is all colored by hindsight. So how do you know that these reports are entirely reliable, like that this is actually what happened? And look, you don't actually need to make any argument that it was all made up of whole cloth. All you have to do is slightly elevate the level of respect, right? Or exactly what Jesus said, to go from level of reverence that would have been displayed towards a teacher who was respected to worshiping God. Like, and we've just established that can be kind of subtle and depends on the exact claim being made and exactly what people did and so forth. Like, you just need a little bit of that notching up that's brought about by hindsight bias and whatever else, that you get what actually happened being morphed into what we see in the Gospels. This is the other thing that you see is that when these defenses are made, that it's just sort of assumed that everything that's reported in the Gospels is 100% factual video footage, like version of what happened, like transcription of the video footage, what happened at the time, which is a completely ridiculous assumption to make. I don't know who this is appealing to. Like, apparently it's appealing to people who believe everything that's reported in the Gospels at complete face value, but are not sure if Jesus was God. Like, did these people exist? Like, who is this appealing to? Anyone, like, you might even take the Gospels very seriously, but if you have doubts about any of the, like, even a little bit of doubt as to, well, is this exactly what happened? Like, maybe there's a bit of hindsight bias creeping in here. Maybe they exaggerated the extent to which respect was given him or the exact title that was used. Then all of this evidence collapses because it's all based on this very flimsy analysis of like exactly which title he accepted from which people at which time and how they responded to him and how much reverence was being given. It's so much of a nothing burger. Like, the only way you can accept it is to already believe everything at face value what the Gospels say. And again, who is in the position of believing everything at face value the Gospels say, but also not being sure that Jesus is God? Like, I guess maybe it's the Jehovah's Witnesses, but they're not convinced by this. Like, they read in a different way. So I don't know who this is supposed to be appealing to.
There are places in the New Testament where it's simply impossible to give any kind of credible explanation of the honors that are shown to Jesus, other than that he's being honored as equal to God. So Jesus in the book of Revelation, chapter 5, is in the very throne room of God, or, lesser status.
Right, I want to hear what the other parts of the acronym are before I go to bed.
Is that God has always existed, that God is eternal in his being, without beginning, without conception of his existence, without a start to his being God even. He's always existed, he's always been God, he always will be. There's no getting, the position has been filled. God is God. And Jesus Christ, of course, had a birth. He had a human birth, a conception, in the womb of Mary, but he existed before that, according to the New Testament, and even before the creation of the world. So John 1:1, for example, in the beginning was the...
Yeah, well, it's really according to John that's true. I guess, yeah, I guess Paul talks about this, but like if you think about the Gospels, like the synoptics don't say anything of the sort about that. I suspect that this was a belief that was developed much later. And maybe Rob would agree with that, actually. I don't know. It's like, well, in hindsight,
God and the Word was God. Verse 3, all things came into being through him. So Jesus Christ is not one of the things that came into being. He is the one through whom all those created things came into being. And he was already there in the beginning. It doesn't say in the beginning the Word started to exist or came to be, but in the beginning the Word was. And then we could go, for example, to John 17:5, where Jesus says to the Father in prayer, glorify me now with the glory that I had with you before the world was. So even before the world came to exist, Christ existed as a divine person alongside the Father and shared in his eternal divine glory. So that makes him God. His divine attributes make him God in terms of what he's able to do. So many of the things that we implicitly are acknowledging Jesus can do when we worship him, when we pray to him, for example, it required divine attributes. So we didn't really get into this, but Jesus receives and answers prayer, according to the New Testament, John 14:14, for example. Well, how can he do that if he doesn't know everything? If he doesn't know your heart, if he doesn't know the future and what's best for you and what's best for everyone around you, how can he make a good choice as to how to answer your prayer? And
I mean, I don't really understand what this argument is supposed to be establishing here. So, look, if God wanted for us to pray via, like, through someone else, surely God could do that, right? Okay, I could pray to my representative, and I'll let him know. I'll like reveal to him or her. Yeah, you don't know. I'll reveal to him or her what the right answer is, and he'll tell you. Like, the representative isn't God. Like, I'm giving them certain powers to act on my behalf or to know things. Surely God could do that if he wanted to, right? Like, I don't understand how we get this idea that, well, look, because someone answers prayers, like, they just have to be the God of the universe. Like, couldn't they just be someone who's representing or acting on behalf of the God of the universe? Isn't it up to the God of the universe how he sort of runs things? Like, how do you know that it has to be the way that you've just said? Like, just declared that it must be that way. Again, it all comes down to the fact that that's the way the fan fiction works, and you don't question it. You just like answer things. You just provide answers that make sense within your fan fiction, the way that it's all been discussed. I know there's variations theologically, of course, but the point is that there's a real lack of critical thinking here, a real lack of asking the questions like, if God existed, what would he do? What would we expect based on whatever assumptions we're making about God's nature? And does it really follow that, like, all of these assumptions we're making about what Jesus must be, given the fact that he answers prayers, like, does that actually follow logically that he must be God? It probably has to have some special connection to God, but does he actually have to be God, which is kind of the crucial point here? Well, it seems to me the obvious answer is no, he doesn't have to be God. It just has to have some kind of connection to God if he's like actually answering prayers. I'm just taking that as given for the sake of argument. It doesn't have to actually be God. Anyway, I mean, maybe you'd say, well, that's the way that God runs it, is that he's the only one who answers prayers. Yeah, but that's an assumption that you're bringing to the table. This is a good point. It's funny that, hey, where'd this go? Among the divine attributes, you never find perfect communicator. Yeah, well, no one would take that seriously, would they? Because God is like the worst communicator in all of history, apparently.
In fact, if he's not omniscient, how can he hear your prayer, my prayer, the prayers of people over in China and Russia,
God can tell him,
South Africa?
God
how can he hear
him.
all those prayers all at the same time? He can't if he's not fully divine in his attributes. This is humorously illustrated in the movie Bruce Almighty.
Yeah, it is.
Where Bruce is authorized by God to answer prayers and finds it's an overwhelming task. I won't spoil it for people who haven't seen the whole scene, but you.
Well, that's interesting, because if God gave him the power, like the whole point of that movie is that Bruce Almighty's given the power of God, but he's actually not given all of the capabilities of God. And it's a way to illustrate the importance of like his humility and understanding his own limitations, right? But like if God actually wanted you to answer everyone's prayers, he could give you the power to be able to do that. Doesn't mean you'd have to give you all of the other powers. Like that's I don't know why I bother with this.
You should watch that scene on YouTube or something, because it really humorously illustrates this point. There are some things God just can't delegate.
Oh, okay.
Now, this isn't detracting from God's omnipotence. It's simply saying omnipotence is something that's not transferable to a finite creature.
Well, first of all, it obviously is, because Jesus was incarnated as a finite creature. He was not initially a finite creature, but then he became one, but also wasn't one. But anyway, putting that aside, you don't need to be omniscient to answer prayers. You just need God to tell you what all the answers are. You don't need to know them yourselves or know everything else. I don't understand where's this logic coming from? It's just being plucked from nothing.
Can't have Bruce know everything and do everything because he isn't up to the job. Well, likewise, if Jesus was just a prophet or even an angel incarnate, or an angel whose life force had been transferred into the womb of Mary to create Jesus, as Jehovah's Witnesses maintain, if that's who Jesus was, he would never have been up to the task of hearing and answering prayers. He wouldn't be worthy of our worship and praise because it's all a little bit beyond him. He has an honorary position, but he's not really God. That would have to be the conclusion. And so at the day of judgment, you would want to ask for the Father to intervene if you didn't like Jesus' judgment, because maybe Jesus is making a mistake. No, Jesus.
Well, if God is delegating to Jesus and God wants the delegation to be successful, then Jesus is not going to make a mistake, is he? None of this makes any sense. He's just declaring that, well, Jesus has to be God because that's the way we say. There's no reason God couldn't have done things differently, is the point I'm making. Even if you're taking at face value, that Jesus answers prayers or whatever. I don't know how you can verify that Jesus answered them correctly or something. But the point is, there's no reason God couldn't have done things differently. And we're just making huge assumptions based on the favored fan fiction to make sense of what we read in the Gospels, right? And there's no actual logic behind this position. It's not like we need to infer what he's saying we should infer about the nature of Jesus. This is just the fan fiction that Christians like to tell themselves, and they sort of admitted this, it was developed in hindsight to make sense of what happened with Jesus. Obviously, there's been disputes over time, but there's sort of a broad consensus among many Christians about what the broad brushstrokes picture is, and this involves Jesus being fully God and fully man at the same time. And then so we just sort of interpret everything in the light of that and make up these silly arguments that, well, God couldn't have delegated things because you just can't delegate things if you're God, apparently, for some reason. I don't know. Just stop asking. You just can't do it that way. If you're omniscient, you can't delegate. That's just how it is. How is this an argument for anything? And this is why I say, again, have apologists just given up? Have they just given up making actual arguments and just saying, well, look, this is the fan fiction we like, so we're just going to believe that now? It really just seems to me like that.
Knows everything. He knows your heart. He knows what's right. He's perfect in wisdom and justice, and he is going to make that call.
So we're talking about hands. H is the honors that Jesus.
Sean it's so hard. He's really trying to get through the hand here, and Rob's just not making it easy because he just keeps going into sermon mode.
Is given the honors that are to be only given to God. Second, the A is the attributes. We see the power of Jesus. We see, in one sense, the omnipresent presence where he can heal at a distance. Yes. We see the awareness of Jesus. He knows what people are thinking, such as the religious leaders in Mark chapter 2, the healing of paralytic. Now, at this point, people would say things.
All of which are powers that God could have given him.
It's like, well, how could Jesus not know the day or hour of his return? I'm going to push pause on that one because you and I are going to come back on Friday and take the toughest questions. I want people to put in, please, your hardest questions about what we're arguing here, other objections to the deity of Jesus, steel man them, and we're going to come back and address those. But for now, let's move to the third one in hand, which is names. Go.
All right, so Jesus has divine names. Now, he doesn't have the name Father, of course, but he does have the name God. He has the name Lord. He has the name Savior. Now, I say name, people are maybe thinking, well, those aren't names, those are titles. Well, in biblical speech or idiom, name and title, it's the same thing. A title is a name. So Jesus has the name King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And sometimes these are combined. So Jesus is called our great God and Savior in Titus 2:13, our God and Savior in 2 Peter 1:1, my Lord and my God in John 20:28. So Jesus has divine names or titles that are given to him in Scripture. And some people may be saying, well, Lord, that just could mean he's like, someone's boss or something. The way these titles are used in the context of the New Testament passages where they appear in reference to Jesus confirms that they are being used in the highest sense, the Old Testament sense.
Okay, so the evidence here is that some followers of Jesus decades later thought he was God and so used titles consistent with God. How is that evidence that Jesus was God or claimed to be God? Even if you're doing the we just take everything that it says in the Gospels at face value approach, all of the references he made are none of the references he made were to anything in the Gospels. And we're talking about what people thought later about Jesus. It's hardly convincing to if you're trying to convince again, I don't know who this argument is supposed to be for, but if you're trying to convince someone Jesus was God, it's hardly convincing to say, well, some people who came afterwards thought he was God. So, most of the New Testament was written by Paul, and Paul didn't even know Jesus. How is any of this convincing? So far, with the three things, we've got, well, people gave honors to Jesus, which seem to be more than the honors that you would give to just a great teacher. If you take everything literally at complete face value of what it says in the Gospels, then it's more than the honors. Of course, you only need to deviate that slightly to say, well, maybe there was a bit of hindsight bias there, and it was elevated a bit more than it really was. Very unconvincing argument. Second one, what was the A? The authority, right? powers. Well, apparently God just can't delegate, right? That's just not a thing that's possible. So if Jesus does miracles or healings and other things, well, he just has to be God. Like there's just no other explanation. When when Moses parted the Red Sea, I guess that means that Moses was God, right? He had the power, so God can't do anything else. It's just how it is. And then the N. Wait, hang on. Hey, can't spell. Names. Yeah, that's right. HAN, names. Well, people who came afterwards who thought Jesus was God called him names that names you would give God. So case closed. Like obviously Jesus was God because people who came afterwards thought he was God. How are these convincing? This is just repeating the Christian fan fiction that I've been talking about. There's no actual argument here. It's just, well, Christians believed it, and so they wrote it as that way and understood it that way and interpreted it that way. Well, yeah, we know that. The question is, was he? There just hasn't been any. The closest we got was this point that, well, God can't delegate, which to me seems completely ridiculous and facile. So if Jesus did a miracle or like was believed and claimed to have done a miracle, then I guess he must have been God, like the only God. I mean, even the Bible says that that's not true, because like the Pharaoh's priests did miracles, right? And so, but they weren't God. They weren't even invoking God's power, because they were opposed to God. So I don't know where any of this comes from. It doesn't even fit its own fan fiction. I need to go to bed, but I want to know what the D and the S stands for. Wish they had timestamps here.
I do it. So you go talk to them and they'll call you God because you're standing in my place. That's how some people explain all this. No, he was already God in the beginning. So Jesus has these divine names, titles, or works, you might put it, has to do with the things that Jesus did or will do according to the New Testament. Now,
what about the deeds? Now we're talking about things Jesus did that indicate his deity.
Yes, deeds or works, you might put it, has to do with the things that Jesus did or will do according to the New Testament. Now, a great bulk of that section of the book deals with the things that Jesus did in his earthly life when he was on the earth. So Jesus performed miracles. Jesus forgave people's sins.
Well, we know that other people can perform miracles.
Jesus stilled the storm with a single word. Sure.
I think forgiving the sins is probably the most convincing one. And it does point this out in one of the Gospels itself, like who can forgive sins but God alone. Again, it does seem, I mean, isn't this even a practice in, I don't know, don't Catholics do this? Like that the priest, I don't want to speak outside my knowledge, but like the priest doesn't forgive your sins. God forgives your sins, but the priest, like, I don't know, he like absolves you of feeling guilty of it as like God's representative or something. If you do this right penances or something, like the point is that you can differentiate someone acting as a representative of God, and them being God himself and like actually doing the forgiving of sins. So once again, all you need here is to interpret the biblical text as being written with a bit of hindsight bias that slightly alters the framing of what actually happened in order to be able to explain how Jesus could seemingly forgive sins and still like not be God. Well, he didn't. Like he was, he saw himself as a messenger of God. Like I don't know how Jesus saw himself, but I'm just saying that this is an alternative explanation. He saw himself as an important messenger of God who could essentially, act in behalf of God, and make statements about what God would want or what God approves of and things like that, but without actually being God himself. Like maybe you'd say that's presumptuous, but it's not obvious that amounts to actually being God, which is the whole point of this, right? The question here is not, the question that's being assessed is not like, does Jesus present himself as a special messenger of God? Because I think that that's clear on any sort of reading of the New Testament. And again, I grant that many, if not all of the authors of the New Testament thought Jesus was God. But the question is, could you see how someone who did and said the things more or less as depicted in the Gospels could at the same time not be God? And the answer seems overwhelmingly, yeah, you could, right? There's very easy interpretive work steps you can make to get to that point without having to just like throw all of the text away. You can just interpret it very slightly differently, which is like exactly what the Jehovah's Witnesses do and things like this, right? And so these claims that, well, Jesus forgave sins and only God can do that. Well, like you don't have to do a lot of work there to understand how, like, I think this is probably the best one. And even there, like, it's not very convincing because you don't have to do much to say, or like he's speaking sort of as a representative of God or as a special messenger or something, and like he's not actually speaking as God. Now, again, let me be clear here. I think that the gospel writers think that Jesus is speaking as God. But what I'm saying is, you can think that the event happened more or less as they described, but they could still be wrong about that because they're interpreting it with hindsight bias. And therefore, you can take most of what the Gospels say as historical fact, like almost completely at face value, and still reject Jesus being God just by recognizing a little bit of hindsight bias and then interpreting the claim slightly differently. That's what I'm saying. So I'm saying that this best defense that Jesus is God is entirely unconvincing, even if you make a lot of very sympathetic assumptions to like taking what the Gospels say very seriously about what Jesus said and did, which I don't think you should do. But even if you do, it's not very convincing. You only get there if you kind of already believe in the Christian fanfic, and therefore are liable to just sort of accept all of the claims that are being made here. Anyway, I think that I'm going to call it there. I'm sorry we missed out I kind of really want to know what the S is, but I can't see when he brings it up here. I'm sure it's something that just demolishes all of the points that I've made and is overwhelmingly convincing, but I kind of doubt that. But I'm kind of done. I need to get to bed. So we're going to call it there. Stop sharing. There are still more things that I want to cover, but we'll have to save those for another stream. Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm just going to have a quick last look at chat here. As is often the case, it's sort of gone completely all over the place. So I don't really know how to respond to a lot of these things. Yeah, this is a good one. So TLDR for the Bible tells me so. Yeah, and the thing is, it's not even that, right? Like it's my reading of the Bible tells me so, because we know that in part this video is designed to appeal to like non-Trinitarians, like Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, was mentioned, and they believe in the Bible, but they interpret it quite differently. And so like they have their own for the Bible told me so. And this is sort of the overarching point that I wanted to make by looking at these two videos, is that the sense in which I'm saying that apologists have given up, or at least some cases have given up, trying to make arguments, is that instead of trying to convince us that we should think this thing is true, what they basically say is, look, this thing kind of makes sense to me, and you can tell a story that to them seems plausible, without actually giving, like, what was the phrase? That's not completely ridiculous, or however it was phrased, not completely impossible. And that's kind of all you need, apparently. Like, you don't actually have to argue that that's true, or that you have evidence for it, or that it's plausible in the light of background knowledge or whatever. You just have to tell the story, and do so in a sort of a confident sounding way. And that substitutes for an argument. And we certainly saw that with Larry a lot in the first video. And I think we saw it in a slightly different way with Rob in the second video, where when presented with very clear questions about, like, well, how can you be infinite and finite at the same time and have these inconsistent properties? We just got kind of a sermon declaring that those were the facts. And then his actual answer was, I don't know, but maybe it's like a particle and a wave. That was the substance of it. And then we went through the HAND acronym, well, most of it. We didn't get the S, so I don't know what the S stands for, but we went through all those. And what we saw is that those arguments only make sense if you essentially take everything completely at face value, what it says in the Gospels, and interpret it through the light of a very particular, what I call Christian fan fiction that was, Rob's own words, made up, well, not own words, but like he said that it was developed by the disciples and early followers of Jesus after the fact, looking backwards to make sense of things that they did not understand at the time. This is why I call it fanfic, because it was made up afterwards to make sense of things that didn't initially make sense. And so interpreting the Bible, the Gospels at face value through that interpretive framework, well, then you get to Jesus being God, right? But that is so flimsy that there's no effort being made to assess why we should take that framework, or why it's plausible, or look at other alternative explanations, or to work through the steps of logic. The closest we got was God can't delegate, and apparently we're supposed to take that as a serious argument. So there's really no substance here. What we just have is just playing out the fan fiction. Like, this is what we believe, and it sort of makes sense to us. And maybe that's who these videos are directed to. It's people who are kind of already basically believe it, but like feel bad sometimes that they don't understand things. And so these videos are just sort of designed to make them feel a bit better. And like plausibly, that's sort of what most of apologetics is for. But what have taken on myself to do is respond to this sort of stuff and show how lacking in substance that it is. I don't want to say that there aren't better arguments for these positions, by the way, and I can't cover everything in one video, but these two videos in particular, looking at the issues of like coming to Christian belief or understanding the nature of Jesus. Those were the two sort of topics that we talked about. Coming at it in this way is just almost complete lack of any substance at all, any real analysis or critical thinking or skeptical mindset or considering alternative explanations and things like that. And yeah, I mean, if that's what apologetics is, then have they given up? Like, I think that there's a case to be made that's just sort of not even trying to do apologetics. All right, I think we'll call it there. Thanks a lot, everyone. Yeah, the world's getting a bit crazy these days, so do take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye.